So we start things off with a general, simple continuation of where we left off, essentially. We get Vincent speaking to all the generals, and of course, as you would expect, Cecilis is immediately running away. It's in character, it makes sense. And we also switch perspectives over to Subaru, where we get to actually see what happened when they tried to go rescue Rem earlier in the previous volumes and everything. So that's great as well, right? We now get to see what happened with him and Beatrice there. It's nice. And then we finally get to see more of what's happening with Subaru, Rem, all of them. And eventually with this, Subaru confronts Todd, and now they're having a face-off here, except not really, because Rem and Katya are there. And because of their general friendship and everything going on, the zombies, all that, them having people they want to protect, they essentially come to an agreement where they'll help each other out and take care of these zombies. And for the most part, they're doing pretty damn well. I mean, they're taking out a whole bunch of them. One of them that appears just so happens to be one of the big one-eyed dudes that Vollachia and Todd killed, right? He's here now, and now he's going to battle them, so, he had a grudge towards Todd. And then Tenza picks up literal fucking buildings and throws it at him. This is the greatest moment that Tenza has had, and that is very shocking of me to say, because I loved that one moment at the end of the whole Colosseum stuff. I really loved that moment, but this is probably her best moment yet. Literal houses. This particular zombie is very fucking persistent, very strong. He manages to get a big injury on Tenza in there. I legitimately thought she was going to die and this was going to be a failed loop. Honestly, it was pretty damn scary. And Louie's kind of injured because of her whole technique that she was doing. But now we have a troubling little situation here. And Subaru and Todd kind of run off since that enemy is focused on them. This whole pride type of thing, and focusing on the ones that essentially are the strong ones here, right? And eventually they land this big explosion on them, take care of them, all that shit. It's great, except for the fact that because of certain things that Subaru said, Todd is now trying to kill him again. There's a general just disagreement here, and it makes sense where Todd is coming from to a degree, but it's clear that Subaru's words weren't meant the way that he said. Obviously, right, it's that kind of moment there, so it's not great. But then we learn about wolf people in Vollachia and how they're not really treated all too well, especially the mole people, all that sort of shit, right? Those two are the big ones there because of shit that happened in the past involving stuff like Yorna, for example, that whole thing. But anyways, wolf people aren't really treated all too well. And on the topic of that, Todd starts becoming a werewolf, which is pretty surprising. I mean, I already knew about it because of a lot of spoilers, but pretty surprising to see overall. It's oh shit, the name Fang makes sense now, but oh, that is definitely scary. And now it's Subaru trying to figure out what to do in this situation, trying to survive all this. And eventually, Emilia gets here, saying the same shit that she did in the third arc. It's real great. She starts fighting Todd, all this, saving Subaru. And right as Subaru's about to get attacked by Todd, Rem comes in, who was also there, and hits him with his axe, sends him flying. But before that, like I mentioned with Emilia, with the whole third arc line, we get to hear Rem say the words, "Don't touch him." And I'm upset that this was one of the things I got spoiled on. Some of the stuff I was okay with. This was a big one for me. This is a moment I was waiting for. I was expecting it in a different format. I was expecting it once she fully got her memories back. But this was very special to me, and I was kind of upset to already know it, because it's man, this is good. This is some good shit. She's trying to protect them. All this. It's so good. But anyways, Emilia finds out that that's Subaru and everything. We also get a backstory to Todd, and it is about, I'd say 8 sentences long. It's incredibly short, and it's very funny. It fits his character, but it's very funny with the way it happens. I'm glad Tepe did that. That was actually good. And the follow-up chapter is just basically Emilia's perspective of things, of, oh, well, here's her arriving and meeting Rem, speaking to Rem, all this sort of shit. and then moving over to Subaru's area. And then we see Vincent planning out some stuff, plans to move, all that sort of shit, since the current area they're in isn't exactly ideal for setting up a strategy or anything like that. We see Sicilis by Sphinx, so that's certainly interesting. We're going to see what happens from there, I guess. And we also get to see the continuation and presumed end of the Priscilla and Yorna versus Arakia fight. Arakia really gets fucked over hard here, like with this chapter. It's kind of brutal. She gets beat up constantly by Yorna, doesn't really get a whole lot of hits in, and then Priscilla just kind of slashes her once, and that's about the whole thing. It's kind of sad. I also kind of thought at first, I was like, oh wait, I wonder, because of the whole zombie thing, could this possibly affect Yorna, right? Could this be a weird gray zone where this also will affect Yorna? Now, I mean, it would have been cool, and I'm okay that it doesn't do that, right? But it would have been cool. And then we get some nice interactions with all the characters, seeing Subaru again, right? The whole camp gets to see him, they're glad, all this. We also get to finally see Rem and Ram reuniting, and as you'd expect, it's a little bit awkward, because Rem doesn't fully know who she is, who Ram is, anything like that, so it's a little awkward, but it is very nice. Once again, I wish I didn't know about this, but it's very nice to see. I like it a lot. And then we get Vincent and Subaru about to speak to each other, and Vincent already knows who all these people are. He already knows they're from Lagunica, all that. So that makes an interesting scenario there. And the following two chapters are genuinely what I might believe to be like the best of the volume. Chapter 6 is pretty damn good, but these might be the best, because we get Vincent and Subaru talking to each other, and we get a whole bunch of stuff here. We see similar elements to Subaru speaking to Priscilla back in the third arc with the two of them, considering the Appas and everything, right? Kind of shows you their whole royalty status, as well as just how similar they are as siblings, right? Subaru's returned by death being perceived as a stargazer ability, all that type of shit, right? So that's also interesting. We see Vincent finally crack as a character, like he shows emotion here, all this sort of shit. It's really fucking great. And we also, at the very end of it, get what I can only assume to be a Gurren Lagann reference. I love that if it's true. I really do love that if it's true. And then the following chapter, we get to see a really great, tough, pill to swallow speech from Subaru. I really love this a lot, right? He's had speeches like this before with like Arc 2 and Rem, right? Arc 4 and Amelia, Arc 6 and Melee. But I think this is the most genuine and proper out of all of them. This is him giving a speech that sometimes, he was on the receiving end of, like, for instance, from Zero, stuff like that, right? I think this is a really great moment for him as a character. He gives this big speech to Vincent about all this shit that's, happened and what Vincent's doing, all this, right, what he should be doing. He goes over possible reasonings with Chiza and everything and what happened there. And then to just top it all off, we get the two of them referring to each other as the Knight of the Kingdom and the Emperor of the Empire, respectively. I love it. This chapter is really damn good. This is probably like the best chapter in the volume, right? The other one is like the second best. This is probably the best chapter in the volume. Then we get another chapter of a lot of people speaking to each other, Subaru informs Katya that Todd might not be alive anymore, and Jamal's also there now. We also get another moment with Ren, which I'm going to coin the term, and this might already be used, but I'm going to coin the term of memory pinch, where she sees how Beatrice and Amelia are acting towards Subaru, and there's something within her heart that kind of reacts, right? I love it. I love it. I love that we're getting closer, right? It feels really good to, tickle all of us a little bit with this shit, tickle our balls a little bit, but it's real great. And then we get the cliffhanger here of, what could have happened to Priscilla and Yorna, because they're not back yet, right? And we don't know what happened. This would be a good cliffhanger if it weren't for the fact that the chapter after immediately follows up with, the whole soul marriage thing is still in use, so therefore they're not dead, they're alive, and probably well. it's like, oh, okay, thank you for doing that then. I don't know what the purpose of that was. And we get this whole last moment where essentially the people of Laguna are going to leave, right, because of Otto's decision, which also Ram agrees with, Roswell agrees with, Beatrice agrees with. It's really just Subaru and Amelia who don't agree with this situation, and they try and come up with a compromise where, oh, wait, okay, how many people are in Vollachia? 50 million? Alright, 50 million people is who we're gonna bring back, and all this sort of shit. And then Vincent, asks Amelia as, one of the candidates of the Royal Kingdom and all this to help him out, right? All that. The funny thing with this is, Otto planned this whole last thing. He knew this was gonna happen, and therefore he planned it, which makes a lot of sense. Otto is insanely smart, so it's not surprising he came up with this whole last plan and was like, oh yeah, no, we can just easily get this to work if we go about it in this way, and then Subaru will say all this stuff. It'll work out. Kind of funny to have that happen. And then, out of fucking nowhere, a moment that I have been waiting for happens, and I was also spoiled on this, but that's okay. A moment I've been waiting for happened that, I wanted to see after reading all the what ifs. We get Halle Bell showing up. This man was just a side story character. He never mattered before, really. I mean, he was a notable figure, right? Because he was one of the big, strong swordsmen along with the other three. And one of those three we still haven't heard about. To pay, please. But, it was this big thing of oh yeah, he's one of them. And now we finally get to see him in the main story. And that makes me very happy. And this is, of course, followed up with Anastasia and Julius also being there now. This should be great. But now that Julius is here, Balroy's back from the dead, Madeline, her whole affiliation with Balroy, so there's that, right? I think this will be a great moment there. And this chapter overall ends with Rowan, the drunk swordsman from all the way back, I think since volume 2, I want to say, maybe the third one. I think it was volume 2 though. And Hanko interacting with one another. And I actually found out that Rowan is the father of Cecilis. So this is an interesting interaction. These two drunk fathers of big swordsmen are now just, hanging out. I kind of like it a whole lot. And overall, that's the volume. I really like it, right? Even though this is just the first volume, it's just 15 chapters, all this, there was a lot more interesting and exciting info within this volume than some of the Arc 7 volumes. Honestly, I would say a majority of the Arc 7 volumes. Arc 7 had some really hype moments sometimes, right? Some really good volumes in there. But there were some that were good to just right? There were a few in there with Arc 7, right? I think that had its problems. Arc 8 so far, though, with just this first volume, has been really damn good. And it makes sense, right? Because this is supposed to be the action stuff of Arc 7. It had to get split because it was going on for too long, so it makes sense. But this is really damn good. It is very entertaining, and I'm very excited to see where we go from here. So, yeah, with that said, that's the first volume. Right off the bat, let me just say, this volume is fantastic. I really can't wait to talk about a bunch of this. But as soon as we start, we basically get another filling us in on what's going on type of chapter, except this one's actually really good. Usually these chapters are kind of just simple because they're just, oh, here's what's happening with these characters and everything. Not necessarily bad, it gives us context, it's just, for the most part, they're very simple, so then it's okay, we'll wait till the next one and see what happens then. This time though, we get some really interesting info. We learn, thanks to Anastasia and Julius and Halle Bell, that essentially this shit was tested, the whole undead type of thing. That was tested in Kararagi, but it was hard to tell who was living and who was dead. It was hard to tell them apart, with the exception of what they needed. So for example, food, water, all that sort of shit, with the exception of that, was overall difficult. So that's a really interesting detail, and that's also kind of horrifying, because it's like, oh shit, unless you can see an oddity in somebody in terms of, how much food they may be going to get, or water, or all this sort of stuff, like, rather than the lack of, right? Unless you can notice that, these people can just be around you, and that's kind of scary. And then we also learn that Groovy might just be out of the fight. He might be dead. He might be part of that army. Who knows, right? It's a worrying thing, because it's like, well, we haven't heard any reports from him, we haven't even seen him, so we don't know what's going on with him. And then, speaking of generals and all that, Sicilis has beaten and killed Sphinx. Sphinx is dead already. That was really quick. So then Beatrice and Roswaal begin to test how the whole undead work in terms of what's more effective, all this sort of shit. Even Garfield is, getting in there trying to see. And as they get further and further in, Roswaal notices some shit about them and generally gauges the idea of who they're up against. And what do you know? That very person shows up. Sphinx shows up. Undead this time. Which is really fucking cool. I think I mentioned something similar to this with the previous review, or something like that with my notes. But the idea of using a spell to resurrect the dead, but then also using it for yourself, technically speaking, like in that sort of manner, is really damn cool and really damn creative. And then we get a really interesting scenario, because we get a chapter where characters are talking, but this is the chapter where a loop happens. That is really interesting. So Roswaal and Beatrice, they're fighting Sphinx, or Garfield, or Zelda, all that, right? All of them are fighting Sphinx. They overall beat Sphinx, and then a big attack of light is produced. But in the carriage area, Subaru, Amelia, Ren, all of them, they're having some chats. And I do like one of the things here a whole lot, which is Amelia kind of teasing Subaru and making it very clear that their relationship is getting even closer, right? We saw it with the previous arc. I want to say like around the end of that. I think it was the end of Arc 7 that we saw that with. I don't think it was Arc 8. I believe it was around the end of Arc 7. But now we're seeing it again here, where yeah, these two are getting even closer. I love it. And, as that whole thing's going on and Rem's confused as to everything that's being said and all this sort of shit, boom, there goes the carriage. So we also get a first time again here type of thing, like I mentioned with the previous chapter, where we get a chapter that doesn't start with the loop, but it actually starts with context as to what happened. And fun fact, I'm gonna steal this joke from my notes, but fun fact, did you know that the Boo Saga is my favorite DBZ saga? Did you also know that the human extinction attack is a pretty cool move? I don't know, I just like writing that down in there, because the way they describe Sphinx's attack is really similar to what you see there. So, I enjoyed that a decent bit. But anyways, regarding the loop, I do really like that this loop kinda happens and Subaru goes immediately into action. I don't think this always has to happen like some people believe. Some people think, oh, why doesn't he just always, get right to it with these loops and everything. I think that's a little fucked to think about it that way because of, what he's going through. But I do like that in this circumstance, his immediate thought was, right, let's go. Plan. Julius, let's go. Okay, that didn't work? Cool. Amelia, let's go. Alright. And then we get Hallibell. And then we learn about a few more things within the next chapter, where Groovy's alive and well, is where Heinkel and Rowan are, so that's interesting. We also learn that Garfield was able to gauge something known as like core bugs, essentially, or he was at least able to help out in the gauging of that. And that's pretty interesting, right? The idea that, oh, all of these are essentially centered to a bug. It's not a specific place on the body, but it's a parasite that exists there. That's pretty damn nice. And then we also see Ubilk mention essentially two beings who are going to turn the whole battle around. One of those very clearly, pointing towards Louis. So I will say at first that had me really worried. And I mean, the arc isn't done yet, so we don't know fully what's going to happen there. But then the other one pointed towards the Divine Generals, and the immediate thing I thought of was, well, with the way it mentions Beastman and 9 Pillars and all this, Groovy, it's going to be Louis and Groovy that are the most important here. And then we get a smaller section where we see more of Groovy and all this, where he's at with Heinkel and Rowan. And we actually learn from here that Rowan, his whole scenario, like, it was weird because it's like, oh, he's Cecilis' dad, but he's never been really mentioned all that much beforehand. And, when he was first found in that, like, bar type of area, he just seemed like a nobody. So it's kind of weird that it's like, oh, this sort of thing with him. But now it makes sense because, oh, he was executed by his son, but he's still alive, he's still hanging around, and now there's just an agreement of, okay, we'll remove your charges, and in exchange, you help me out. And then we don't really get too much after that, with the exception of we learn more about Groovy and his affinity towards, curse arts, weapons, all that sort of shit. So then we get some build up towards the message that Flop has for Vincent that Shiza gave him. We also, just to mention it before I mention the big thing here, we get more with Ren in terms of her increasing emotions, I'm gonna say, and all that sort of shit. I really like that Tepei's just kind of pulling at the string here, just little by little, inch by inch, moving her back to the original position. I'm curious of how we might get there, right? I feel like at this point, after everything that's happened, it's going to happen. But then we learn the overall big thing here of Louis. Louis, as to be expected, isn't very trusted by the group. They're allowing her to be there, but they don't really trust her. The only two who are kind of joining Subaru's side here in a way is Emilia and Beatrice. And Beatrice is pretty shocking. But Emilia and Beatrice, for their own reasons of course, but it's an overall viewpoint of, if Louis can prove herself to be a better person, then she's a better person, right? It's a matter of proving herself. A lot of the others just don't view her that way. They just view it as, this is a problem that we have on our hands. Those two, as well as Subaru, it's like a kind of thing where they expect her to fully change in some way, and that can properly, validate her existence. And then we get one of the, probably single-handedly, one of the best chapters in the series, in my opinion. Is it biased? Probably. But look at my top, overall the top sections of my tier list. It should be clear there. We get one of the best chapters, because we get the conversation about Louis, regarding, her, Rem, Subaru, and the rest of the group, all this sort of stuff. But mainly it's just those three in the room discussing while Rem and Tenza are also there. And it's the very clear, heartbreaking conversation about who Louis is. And the real heart-wrenching thing is Rem doesn't want to hear it. This, pains her. But she already knows. She already knows who Louis is, what Louis done, all this sort of shit. It made sense in her mind, right? It was odd to her that Subaru held this much disgust for her and all this sort of shit. But it came into full realization of, oh, my memories are gone. It's possibly due to that thing. I say thing, like that sounds horrible, but like, you know what I mean. So that's a real heart-wrenching moment because she realizes this child she really enjoys and is very kind and all this sort of shit is also the reason that, you know, she's the way she is. And she starts really breaking down here, saying like, oh, but like, the way she is now, you know, she's fine and it's just me. I'm just the person who's affected. And we get a really great moment here where it's not necessarily rude, but it's kind of a harsh thing, a harsh reality that Rem has to face that Subaru brings up to her of, no, it's not just you. It is multiple people. Multiple people have been affected by her and her siblings. This is not just a you issue. And I love that, as much as that's like, you know, a punch to my favorite character. It is a great moment because it's a wake-up call, right? It's just a wake-up call to, hey, this isn't just about you. This is a problem for everybody, right? And I love that type of shit. I made the shitty Boo Saga joke earlier, but there is a moment with that in the Boo Saga that I really do love, which is the introduction, pretty much, or the prelude to the introduction of my favorite character. I know I have the same favorite character as fucking everybody with that series too, but that scenario I really love because with that series, Vegeta in that specific moment is acting very stubborn and all this sort of shit, and Goku quite literally tells him, wake up, and mentions everything that's been done, all this sort of shit, what's going to happen if they don't work together, and then they work together because Vegeta realizes that shit. And from there, my favorite character is born. But, you know, we get that really great moment of it's a wake-up call to him. And we get that with Rem here, too. But then, oh my god. Okay. We get two different callbacks here, and this is, like, so fucking good. We get two separate callbacks here. Let's start with the first one, in terms of chronological order, or at least, I believe this is chronological order. Subaru gives Louie a new name. Louie is no longer Louie. As a means to change herself, as a means to become a new person, and not, you know, the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony. He gives her a new name. It's fitting because it's a star one, but it's also fitting because of who's involved in this scenario. He calls her Spica. Some of you might not be familiar with that. I feel like if you're at this point with the volumes, you probably will be, but if you're not, that's okay. Let me fill you in a little bit. That name's from the Slothif, the one where Subaru and Rem get together. That's from that. And in case you're curious on where that name's in there, that's the name of their daughter. They took a name, Teppei took the name from that, which yes, of course, still is related to the stars, but he took the name from that and gave it to Louie. Not only that, he referenced From Zero in here. And you get this big old hug with, like, Spica, we're gonna say Spica now, Spica and Rem and all this sort of shit, and it's so fucking beautiful. This is genuinely one of the best chapters, and depending on what Spica does from here, she really might beat out Wilhelm. I know some people think me putting her that high is like a little weird. I don't know. I've really enjoyed her growth from a villain to what she was with Arc 7, and now this. I'm at a point where I am just ready to put this character on my top 10. I love this character. This character is fantastic. I'm worried if this character dies. So then we get a really great chapter about Otto, and generally he's not taking certain things that were said from Julius super well, as well as stuff that Julius then goes on to say, as well as what Roswell tries to do regarding, you know, his own plans and stuff like that. But we also get a great moment here that I like a lot that's kind of smaller in this chapter because it's mainly an auto-focused chapter, where when Spica is mentioned, right, with this whole thing with Spica, and it's like, oh, this is Spica, right? This is the new person here. It's not really treated as Spica, cool, all is forgiven, you know, like, oh, this is our new friend, part of our team, and all this sort of shit. Everybody is still cautious. You know, Ram's still being attentive with her. Tenza isn't fully sure if she sees this as the right thing to do and all that sort of shit, right? This is still a Sin Archbishop they're dealing with, right? They don't ignore that, and I like that a lot. Some series would possibly ignore that, and as much as it could be like a cutesy little moment, you still have to consider who the person involved is, right? Like, it doesn't really work like that. So I like that here, where it's just like, okay, she's changed her name, right? Or rather, you've changed her name, and she might be better from here, right? But she has to prove herself, because if not, she's just still the Sin Archbishop with a different name. So I like that a lot. So then we get even more EX novel connections. We're getting a lot of EX novel connections within this arc and also arc 7, but like a lot within this arc, where we finally receive, you know, the message that Shiza had for Vincent regarding the whole thing, the strategy of what to do, but also there's the thing with Flop and how he'd like to know, as well as Medium, would like to know what happened to their sworn brothers, you know, Miles and Balroy. And this is something interesting. I'm a little bit dumb, and I didn't realize when I was reading EX1 that was Miles in there. I somehow failed to consider that the person in EX1 looked really similar to the person I saw in EX5. I don't know how I missed that. And Balroy's whole thing, with like his scenario of being a traitor and all that, his goal was mainly like not to, you know, betray the Vollachia like empire, all this sort of shit. It was more so aimed at Lagunica in a way, not necessarily that, but more so getting revenge for the person who, you know, killed his brother. Which is funny, because his, you know, aim was like, oh, Julius, Reinhardt, like all of those three, which I guess one of them was Felix. I mean, that's kind of close. You're kind of close. You just got to go a little bit above that branch, and you found them. But yeah, like, it's a little bit of a funny scenario to think about now. Of, man, he couldn't even focus on the actual like target. Like the target wasn't there, right? It's also interesting because this leads into a direction of, oh shit, so he was getting revenge for his brother, then he died, then Madeline showed up, and Madeline's now trying to get revenge for him, so Madeline's gonna fight Julius, and that's gonna be justified. So, that's really damn interesting. And we also get the final tidbit here, where Medium will likely become one of the many future wives of Vincent to then, you know, have the next child for the Empire. That should be pretty interesting. Also, a little bit of a side note here, but think about the EX1 thing more, is now making me realize how funny that would be if Balroy's like, oh yeah, you know, I'm gonna go get my revenge now, like now that I'm back from the dead. And it's just like, cool, so your opponent is very crippled in terms of their brain. Their body is also very crippled. They're basically bedridden. Go get them. So now we have a whole bunch of shit going on. There's a three-headed dragon that was from, I don't necessarily want to say EX2, because it wasn't really EX2, but it was in relation to that. The whole scenario with Wilhelm and all that, and the previous Wallachian Empire leader, all that sort of shit, you know, Stride, all that. That whole scenario is where, from what I understand, the three-headed dragon comes from. I haven't actually read that yet, like that little description type of stuff, but I do have the general idea of what happens there, and I believe that appears. But we also have the Prune Corpse from, you know, EX5 that Lamia had, and speaking of her, she's here now on the battlefield, multiple of her, and she's fighting Gauze, which had me really worried about Gauze, and honestly for a moment, I was like, oh, well, you know what, it'll be A-okay, because I know somebody's gonna show up, and they'll fight Lamia. Well, I got proven wrong in an interesting way. Then we get another fantastic chapter. Not as good as the, whole Spica type of one, but in relation, technically. We get the continuation of Lamia's battles, and, she's fighting Gauze, kicking Gauze's ass, fighting Garfield, kind of kicking Garfield's ass. Garfield transforms, and then, that battle reaches an interesting point. But overall, there's a lot of problems here involving Lamia, and one of the biggest problems being because of the brother she used in EX5 that she's once using again, here, like his whole ability. This creates a scenario where she knows where all the important individuals are, but also specifically Vincent. So she goes right to Vincent, because, cut him down, not only do you win, but you cut down the Emperor. That's pretty big, right? It means you won. So, goes right to him, and she really gets upset, right? She gets absolutely, pissed at him. A little bit before that, I believe, we get a moment with Berset's kind of just, turning into a meteor, like a human meteor, and just crashing into one of the Lamias. I don't think it's specifically the one that's there. At least with the way it was written out, it didn't feel like it was the one that's there. But he kind of just does that to one of them that's, I believe, in the carriage area. So there that one goes. And Berset's, I assumed, was going to be dead, but from the general information gathered on the next chapter, he's still alive, he was saved. I think possibly by Frederica, because I mentioned somebody with golden fur. So I'm going to say Frederica, which is great, because honestly, if it is her, I'm glad. She gets to at least do stuff. I wish she did more. I really wish she would get more than just the weird, kind of gross Klein stuff, and just give her proper story moments past Arc 4 at least, right? Especially because, technically speaking, outside of the web novel, the light novel and the anime versions kind of just give her less in terms of Arc 4. Really just need to give her more overall. But anyways, Lamia gets absolutely pissed and tries to strike down Vincent, and then Subaru and Spica show up. And I was like, man, what are they gonna do here, right? How's this gonna work? And then I understood the strategy. Subaru says her name out loud, full name, and Louis goes... I'm trying to conjure up how you would say this correctly in her type of speaking manner. It would be like, ow-e, or something like that. And that roughly translates to let's eat. They use the authority of gluttony to take her name. And the rest of the Lamias are now just fucked. They're motionless. That's it, right? She's still okay. And from what I can tell, she's not necessarily, out of everybody's minds, but it's still generally affecting her in some way. And this actually new ability gets renamed to Star Eating, which I like a lot. But then Balroy comes in to save her, and they just piss off out of there, right? I'm not necessarily surprised that this fight isn't going to continue here, because this seems like a pretty damn big fight for the arc, and this will presumably be one of the last battles. But it's kind of saddening that, the last chapter here, they're just out. That's it. Peace. But, yeah. Then Lamia returns to the, Crystal Palace, and we get a really interesting scenario here. I'm so confused, but I'm so intrigued as to what's going on. So Lamia's by the dungeon area of the Crystal Palace, and chained up is Priscilla. That is something I wasn't expecting. I thought Priscilla was going to come in and fight Lamia, right? I thought the implication was going to be, oh, these two are going to fight, and unlike EX5, we're not going to cut away. We're going to get a proper fight this time. We still might later. Priscilla's chained up right now, though, which has me really curious. Because the last time we saw her, she was fighting Vollachia with her mother. And they won, presumably. They landed a devastating blow against her. While we didn't see the, sections in between that, it has me really curious on, okay, how did Priscilla lose? How did she get chained up? Where is Yorna? All this sort of shit, right? There's a lot that's happening just in that moment alone from seeing her locked up there. That's like, wait, hold on, okay. That's a lot to digest, because that implies a lot of things, and there's all sorts of scenarios that could have played out, and that is really intriguing. We also learn here, because Balroy speaks to her, the undead kind of come back because they're not satisfied and have grudges towards people, right? So Balroy, he still wants to get revenge, right? That sort of thing. Like there's revenge sort of stuff related there, or wanting to kill somebody who might have killed you. There's other people who didn't come back because they were satisfied with their lives, which is pretty damn interesting. Overall, that's all we get out of this chapter. We get more Hallibell by the end, which is kind of weird, because it just ends with him defeating the dragon, and then, running back to, where the carriages are. We're trying to follow, back to the carriages. It's a little odd, because it's like, oh, that's it. Okay, a little bit of a weird place to end it on, but at least the Priscilla stuff leaves enough intrigue as to, what the fuck is going to happen next, right? Or what are we going to learn about with her, right? At least there's something there. And overall, that's it. That's the volume. This was a fantastic volume. Arc 8 is really shaping out to be super damn good. And I know this was going to be Arc 7, the later parts of it, all that sort of shit originally. It definitely would have improved Arc 7. If this was in there, if this managed to be in there, this would have been better than the third arc for me. But as it is right now, right? I mean, if we were to view it as Arc 7 as a whole, right? Just Arc 7 Part 1 and Arc 7 Part 2. If we viewed it that way, this would be better than the third arc for me. If we separate Arc 8 from it, right? It's no longer Part 1, Part 2. It's just Arc 7, Arc 8. Arc 8 right now is shaping up to be possibly better than Arc 5 for me. That is really damn good. That means it's going to be my new second favorite. This is a very good arc so far. It's a matter of what happens next, how stuff's handled and everything, but this is fantastic. I especially love the EX novel stuff. The fact that all this information presented to us from the EX novels is finally coming into play is awesome. And this is for an arc that wasn't necessarily fully planned out, but I can see why it was added in, because it would make a lot of sense to just have in there, right? This works out really damn well. I am absolutely loving the shit out of this arc, and I'm very curious to see where we go from here. So, the fifth volume is interesting for me. We'll go into why later on. But just to start off with it, I just want to mention that it's interesting on how it's done, for me personally. First chapter, it's real short, but we get this interesting start between this backstory section where we don't really know who these characters are, to then cutting to Yorna, who is now, we're going to refer to as Iris, for reasons obviously we'll get into, and Ugard, whatever, however you're going to say his name. I'm not entirely sure. Arc 7 and Arc 8 kind of fucked up. They present me with a lot of names sometimes that I am not fully ready to say, but regardless, we have these two interacting, and this is something that I didn't think of, but honestly it makes a lot of sense what happened here, because I'm like, oh right, yeah, the whole sacrament shit, of course he would come back, right? So then they're gonna interact, and wow, I knew that he was somebody from way in the past, so usually there's the expected result of how people way back when would act, but yeah, he doesn't seem the greatest, even if, Iris has a nice loving connection to him. He doesn't seem the greatest. He doesn't seem super nice. So, there's that. But now Iris has a, different look. She doesn't look like the same kitsune that she was before and all this sort of shit. It's like a proper dress, no kimono, no hair ornaments, nothing like that. Proper, just long flowing hair. It's interesting. And also the illustration to this section is interesting because we get this nice little, like, I'm not gonna say that this is supposed to be like, oh, a reference to Priscilla fully, because Iris herself, like, as Iris, didn't give birth to Priscilla. That's way back when, right? But she, interestingly, in the past, looks exactly like Priscilla, or at least very similar. Like, orange hair, super long, all that sort of shit. It's like, it's interesting. I like that detail a lot. Also, fun fact that I forgot to mention before, I only kind of realized it when I was watching Nura, like Rise of the Demon Clan, which, by the way, great show for Season 2, it's a fantastic Season 2. Season 1 of that, it's okay. But if that whole thing were to interest you, if you were to see the bio of that anime and it were to interest you, my only thing I could say is if you can get past Season 1, that show is fantastic. Anyways, besides talking about other series, something with that I realized in the moment of watching that, because of some research I did for the 10-year project, that I can't speak about, and it's just so fucking painful, and I'll also get to why later, but something interesting with that I realized because of research I did with the 10-year project is the fact that Yorna's a weird reverse of the general Kitsune type of story. That might seem confusing on what the fuck I'm saying, so let me essentially explain it. So, Kitsune, right? Their whole deal in mythology and all that sort of shit, folklore, whatever the fuck, is that they take possession of a female body, right? They essentially, like, take over it completely. That's the whole thing with it, is they go into that body, they take over, boom, they are that person, right? And from then on, they live as that person, right? That's the whole thing with them. Yorna's interesting, though, or Iris, whichever name we want to use there. Technically speaking, Iris would be more correct in this manner, because she's kind of the reverse of this, because the whole point of a Kitsune is that they are foxes that enter, essentially, humans, right? Human women. Iris is a human woman who, because of Yorna's, like, body, essentially, she is a human woman entering a Kitsune's body. That is pretty fucking cool. I actually like that a lot. Like, once I realized that, I just sat there and looked at fucking Yorna's design, all this sort of shit. Like, I looked at some of the details and everything, and I just realized, like, oh my lord, Teppei, you fucking genius. Like, I don't know how I didn't think of this before, but it's like, holy shit, oh, of course, that's why this works like this. Of course, like, the Iris thing isn't out of nowhere. That's why it felt natural to me, right? That's why when the information was revealed, it felt proper, because I was like, oh, wait, because that's correct, technically. Not really. I mean, it's the reverse, it's the opposite, but, like, it works. It's proper, right? Weird to say proper in this scenario, but you get what I mean. Like, it's something interesting where you're taking a concept and twisting it, and I like that a lot. Yorna is probably my favorite Arc 7 or 8 character so far, right? I think out of the whole batch that we've learned about through Arc 7 and 8, she is probably my favorite, and it's very fucking unfortunate because of reasons we'll get into later. So then we get a general kind of recap chapter, but it does feature two key details. One being that these zombies aren't exactly acting on their own wills, which makes sense because even though you could say Lamia would possibly hold a grudge or something like that, it doesn't seem super in character, because I guess the whole thing with the, the royal family would be whoever gets taken out, right? The weakest fall, that's the whole, like, the whole thing with Vollachia is the strong survive, right? So, of course, yeah, if she falls, she's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm weak, right? Like, whatever the fuck, right? It's kind of this thing of just, once you've, fallen, you've accepted your fate. You've accepted, okay, I'm not part of the, I'm not going to be the next ruler, all this sort of shit. So, it makes sense. But, instead, they might be acting on a directive from Sphinx. Now, what is that directive? We don't fully know. We get a kind of hint with the next chapter, but it's not entirely correct, because it wouldn't seem natural for Sphinx in her current
scenario, not even current scenario, but just in general. But then we get a second little piece of information regarding one of the 4 great spirits, Muspel, the stone. Interestingly, Sphinx is using Muspel to essentially fund this army, right? And the problem with that, which I think they actually go into with the next chapter, but I mean, might as well speak about this. These 2 chapters kind of just interlude with one another, so if I delay some information, that's okay. But generally the thing with Muspel is using it in this format to constantly resurrect this army is real fucked, because Muspel is essentially funding, like, the Vollachia itself. If funding's a weird term to use here, but the real way to put it is, as long as Muspel's there, Vollachia survives. Muspel disappears, right, dies, or whatever the fuck, runs out of mana, whole place goes boom, right? So the problem becomes, oh shit, well, they're using Muspel to bring these people back from the dead. Then our guys die, they get brought back from the dead, so that uses mana. But then if they're killed, they get brought back from the dead, so that's a problem. And then if our dudes get killed after being killed, they get brought... It's a constant cycle of, we are literally ramming this thing into the fucking ground. It is going to destroy this whole place. The Great Disaster was never this big, fierce attack. It technically was. But it was never just a big, fierce attack. What the Great fucking Disaster was, and this is super damn interesting, what it was this spirit dying. This spirit dies, this whole place is gone. That is something they can't prevent, right? Rather, they can, they figure out a plan, and we'll get into that, but it's more so this thing of, try and fight it, you're fucked. Try and back off, you're fucked. So it's kind of the thing of, okay, now we need to really narrow this down to one option. Now, the good news is with Muspel is, unlike somebody like Puck, there isn't really a contractor here or anything like that. Technically speaking, they do send people who are sentenced to death down there to essentially, feed it a bit. There is that, but overall, it doesn't have contractors. But the main point of Muspel here, kinda, is so that Sphinx can use this to destroy this place and then possibly try it with the kingdom and all that. Not out of revenge, though. That's something that they make clear, is there's definitely a chance that this could be used on the kingdom of Lagunica and, like, maybe, fucking Gusteco and all that sort of shit, right? But it's unknown that it's for revenge, because, or rather, it's unknown if revenge would even be a motive, because the scenario of this is Sphinx wouldn't really act on that, right? Sphinx doesn't have emotion. That's the clear-cut thing with Sphinx, and that's something we've known for the longest while now. So it's very clear just from this that, okay, this might not be, like, the motive necessarily, but it might be the whole, like, okay, she's focused on the destruction of this stuff. So it's still important, but, and yeah, like, this serves as a test, but, we don't fully know what this is going to lead to, right? Now, with that said, they do come up with the plan to essentially counteract this by being like, okay, so Sphinx is the one who's, the head of this charge. If we take her, right, we just capture her and just hold onto her for a while, this whole thing goes to shit, right? They can't do anything. Sphinx can't resurrect more people and all this sort of shit, and what the fuck can they do, right? They can't act on their motives and all that. So that's the little interesting thing there. Anyways, Vollachia is down where Muspel is, so that doesn't bode well for things. And then we have the next 2 chapters. I don't have much to speak about with the next chapter, because if I'm going to be real, the next chapter after the previous one that I talked about was just planning. I'm not fucking kidding, by the way, in case you're, like, seeing this without actually reading it or anything. It's just planning, really. There's not that much actual information that's given other than, okay, you are coming with us, and you are staying back here, and all that sort of shit. It's really just planning. However, we do get an interesting little chapter where we get to see Gustav and Idra kind of defend Subaru a bit in front of Vincent. I like that. I like that a lot. Shows how essentially, like, loyal he's made them. Not necessarily like, oh, he's, taking their loyalty away from Vincent, but rather he's managed to impress them so much that they're like, you know what? I like this guy. I like this little man. You know, I like him, right? And we also get to see Medium, of course, speaking to Vincent about, yeah, I want to go over there, talk to Balroy, all this sort of shit. So now we have the reason for why, you know, Medium's gonna head into the battle, and of course not flop or anything like that. So that's pretty cool. And then again, we don't get really much for the next chapter after. It's kind of just dialogue for people, you know, leaving and all that, and I like it. But there is one example I want to focus on because, yes, I have a fucking bias here. Are you surprised? Of course I do. I mean, I'm not going to act weird like some people might, but yeah, of course I'm going to have a bias here. So allow me to speak about the final interaction of this chapter, Rem and Katya, who essentially, they explain this thing of Rem kind of wants Subaru to tell her all about who he is, who she is, all this sort of shit when he gets back. And in chapter 32, which is a chapter I didn't speak much about, but in chapter 32, there's this really interesting interaction where I guess because of like the whole thing, they mention sometimes that there's feelings still attached to her soul. Even if she doesn't remember things, there are feelings still attached to her soul. Like that with, you know, her sister and all that sort of shit. And interestingly, a comment she makes in chapter 32 is, you know, she kind of makes the comment to Subaru about, oh, well, you can always, you know, just cuddle with, like, Amelia to get, you know, some warmth or whatever the fuck, right? Like to, you know, to feel better, all this sort of shit, right? And it's a really interesting, like, comment to make, because as soon as you see that, it's like, that reminds me of the third arc. That reminds me of that bit of jealousy she had on occasion in the third arc, like around, I'm going to call it the episode 15 area. Like, I know the episode 15 didn't really delve into it that much, but that general kind of area, right? It's like, oh, that's similar to that. Oh, so, you know, that's interesting. It's like, oh, that feeling's still attached to her. But at the same time, at the end of this exact chapter that I was speaking about, specifically, you know, the one right now, the dialogue one, Rem and Katya, all that. A little confusing on my wording there, I know. But at the end of this exact chapter, you get this nice scene where Subaru's waving off to her, and she starts giving a dumb smile and everything, and it's just like, and she tells him to return safe, and it's like, dude, I have a feeling, I got a feeling that maybe by the end of this arc we'll get a happy ending. I'm worried about Spica's safety, right? I think Spica could totally get screwed over here. I love the idea of one of the archbishops actually joining along and becoming friendly and all that. But something really tells me with the way that Spica interacts and all this sort of shit, and just, like, no dialogue, nothing like that, right? Just kind of ahs and oohs and all this sort of shit. Something really tells me, and like, the way she changed, it tells me that she's probably going to sacrifice herself to give Rem that shit back. I don't know why, right? I could totally be wrong here. And in a way, I partially would like to be wrong. But I just have a bad feeling about it. So then, we get some conversations between Jamal and Subaru, where Jamal kind of has like, contrasting ideas with him and everything, and Subaru's like, you know what? I'm going to make sure you go home alive and see your sister and all that sort of shit. And you know, he finds him annoying. Other than that, there's really not much to this chapter once again, with the exception of Al and Cecilis are now near each other again. And the following chapter, we actually get more of that. We get to see Al do some cool shit. We get to see a little bit more of his ability and this whole territory expansion sort of stuff. It's interesting, right? I mean, this is generally what got listed before, is it's kind of a territory sort of thing, and now we're kind of seeing that with the verbal dialogue. And then, you know, Cecilis is still around, still helping out a little bit. If anything, Al's kind of helping him more because he's recklessly charging in. But yeah, I mean, now we have this cool dynamic between the two of them. And then Heinkel, Groovy, and Rowan finally arrive and all this sort of shit. So obviously Rowan has some interaction with his son. And the interesting thing about that, of course, being that we learned some things about Rowan. And, you know, Heinkel had some things that were upsetting, to say the least, right? He had some things that made you real upset with the way he interacted, but you know what? There was obviously a very clear end goal with him, right? Like, I know there was this general thing of, like, I believe his wife, whatever, like, he wanted to help her out, right? So, it's kind of this thing of, okay, Heinkel makes sense, kind of where he's coming from. He's having a rough life. His actions aren't justified, but it's understandable because he's having a real rough life, right? Rowan is a scumbag, to put it lightly, because right off the bat, it's just listed, yeah, he's killed a decent bit of his own children, just to make the strongest child, and then Cecilus was born, and he beat him, and it's this whole thing of, cool, this child, this is the strong one, I'll keep this one, and that's also the reason he wanted to assassinate Vincent. He's a real interesting character. He is... This is, like, impressive. It's kind of impressive that these two key figures, these two immensely strong ones, have some interesting fathers. Almost makes me curious about Hallibell and everything. I mean, we might not know that much, or we might not even learn that much, I don't know. Maybe there's some side stories, right? That obviously might be something that happens. But, yeah, I'm interested about Hallibell, and there's I believe there was also a dude from Guseko, like the Crazed Prince or whatever the fuck. Wondering how he might be. Maybe his father, whatever it may be. I mean, we already know some people from that place. And then we get a good chapter to go into Rowan's motives and all this sort of shit, because he's trying to chase the heavenly sword and all this. You know, the same stuff that Reed... Yeah, I'm saying it correctly this time. Reed. I apologize for constantly saying Raid. Raid just sounds cooler. But I've realized by now it's Reed. So, fuck. But anyways, it's the same, you know, shit as Reed and all that. And it's this whole thing where it's like, oh yeah, he's pushing for that dream. And also, he's a stargazer, except it's weird. They kind of get a little complicated with the whole stargazer term in this specific volume, because it's very clear, like, okay, it's specific ambition sort of related stuff, but at the same time, it functions separately than the stuff like Ubilk. Like Ubilk and Medium. Not Medium. Why am I forgetting her name? Oh no. This is bad. I used to be super good at remembering ReZero character names. Fuck. That's not her name. But you know who I'm referring to. Anyways, the point is, them, right? They know what's coming, right? Rowan's weird. At least I think this is what it's implied to be, because it's not necessarily knowing what's coming, but it's kind of this scenario of the whole ambition thing I mentioned. This volume really complicated this term. I just assumed that this was a thing of, okay, yeah, they understand what's coming, and they threw me for a loop here. So that was wild. But we get to see a lot more of Rowan, but there's something else I really want to discuss here, because I feel it's way more important. So Iris shows up. The most painful line of dialogue. It is so fucking simple. Like, it is legitimately hurting me just to think about. The most simple line of dialogue is given by her, where Rowan is just speaking, and she states her name, and she just says Iris, and that is the whole statement. And that's just a name. That is just a name that is said. And yet, somehow, seeing that, I felt like I had thorns in my fucking chest. Because that was just oh no. Like, that was an immediate realization of, Yorna's not here anymore. Yorna is she is forced to fight on their side. Fuck. Right? And it's so painful. And part of that is because she's, like, so far my favorite character of the two arcs and everything, right? My favorite character that's been introduced here. All this sort of shit. Part of that is 10-year project stuff, which I can't even speak about, and I fucking wish I could. Please just hurry up and figure out the hints. I'm not even trying to say that aggressively, so I apologize if you took it that way. But, fuck, I wish I could speak about that, because, there's a lot I could relate to. That alone, comparing it to this alone is a big hint, alright? You just gotta find it. I know I'm being vague with it right now. I'm gonna be vague with it for a while. I'll go into that later, right? I will speak more about that later when I'll be less vague, right? Specifically, when I say that, I don't mean I'm going to be less vague later. I more so mean I'm going to be less vague in the future, and I'll explain why and when and all that sort of shit. Anyways, point is, I wish I could talk about it because of that. But instead, let me pinpoint it to one thing. And this is one of my favorite elements of Yorna's character. And this is why it hurts. And this is fantastic character development, don't get me wrong. Tepei, you are fucking cooking right now, right? This stuff with Iris, you are fucking cooking. This is good. This is very good. This is absurdly good, right? This food is like on fire, but it's still good, right? That is still some juicy ass food, right? Here's why. I'm gonna pinpoint it. Yorna, her whole character was established as this mother-like figure, right? She was this mother to everybody in the Demon City, and I really fucking like that. It's something very simple, but this character just being super nice to everybody, treating them as her own children, regardless of age and all that, I love it, right? I love that a lot. There's something so kind and heartwarming to that it's beautiful. So to see somebody like that, who is, absolutely happy with the life they live now, right? Even if they've been constantly reincarnated, they've found their peace with this life. And to then have the person from their original life show up and say, hey, putting these thorns in your chest, you're gonna help me, right? You're gonna help me out, right? And on top of the fact that, she still holds that love for him and everything. And she is backed into this corner where that doesn't matter anymore, and we will get into that soon, right? I will go more into that specific detail of it doesn't matter anymore soon, because there's something else chapter related that we gotta talk about later on, right? With one of the the actual end chapter. I forgot it was the end chapter, but the end chapter. We'll get to that. Point is, seeing somebody like that, somebody like this kind and everything, and heartwarming and all, and with this motive, backed into a corner where they are forced to abandon that, is so fucked up. Like, that is like, oh my god. It's so simple, but it's so fucked up. Like, the fact that, she still cares in the sense that she wants people to leave the Imperial City, right? She doesn't want anybody to get hurt. But it's still this thing of, like, she's backed into a corner and now just has to fight. It hurts. It hurts to see her like this. I hope she's just completely okay by the end of this. I do not want to see any issues with her. I have a feeling that next volume, Tens is probably going to come in here. I know Tens is kind of laying back, but I mean, there's a detail I kind of want to go into regarding this. We'll get to it with the last chapter, alright? Just fuck. Alright, so now I'm going to lightning round these next 3 chapters because it's not like an insane amount happens here, so let's just go through it. So, Al, Cecilis, and Groovy are essentially a group. Like, Heinkel and Rowan were with each other, and they kind of split up. Now, Al, Groovy, and Cecilis are their own group. And the whole thing with that, I mean, we learned 2 things here is, oh yeah, Cecilis is also a stargazer, that whole thing. Very complicated kind of scenario, right? On top of the fact of, also, they got thorns in their chests, so Ugard is coming into play. Damn, right? And Heinkel goes to fight the fucking dragon that Madeline controls and all that sort of shit. And also, Madeline gets strangely knocked out, I think by Balroy, which is interesting. I'm curious on what the fuck that is implying or leading to or whatever the fuck. It's kind of weird, right? It's making me wonder, okay, I know Sphinx is in control of them, but what the fuck's happening here, right? Oh boy. But Heinkel's trying to fight the dragon. He's absolutely getting fucked right now. But then we head back to Groovy and all them, and Groovy's gonna fight Ugard while Cecilis goes to look for the sword and everything. Ugard actually has the sword. He has it, and as well as his own Yang sword, because of course he does, right? He's a member of the royal family, so of course. We get a lot here, and I like it, right? Because it's like, oh, it's setting up for the fights. But I mentioned this in my notes. I kind of wish we got the proper fights here. We get a few here and there, or we get like tidbits of it. For example, the final chapter, right? I get to talk about that soon. But, like, for the most part, it's not anything huge. It's just a lot of, these characters are fighting this person, these characters are fighting this person, these characters are fighting this. Like, it works, and honestly, given the side story that happens at the last chapter, it's very clearly, at least in my opinion, the final volume might actually be the next one. Specifically because they list it in the side story as you know, the final battle is like approaching and all this sort of shit. And it's like, well, if all these fights are being set up, I think this implies we are about to head into the final battle, right? This is the end, like this is the end of the arc. Probably, right? This next volume will probably be super long, and we're just going to get to the end of it. I assume we could get another, but seeing as this was split, like this is what I expected from the beginning. Seeing as Arc 7 and 8 were split, I expected Arc 8 to be like 4 volumes long. That might sound absurd to some people because it's like, oh, well, you know, most of the time they're like 5 volumes and all that sort of shit, but it hasn't been uncommon to have something around that range. I would say, like, don't get me wrong, we haven't really had volumes that go up to 4, but 5 has usually happened. 6 on occasion has happened, but that's because if they're super long and everything. Like, Arc 6 is decently long, but that's still 5 volumes. Arc 8 is a split of Arc 7, yet at the same time, because it's a split at that moment, it very easily could be 4, right? And this kind of feels like it's leading into that. I like that these fights are being set up for that sort of thing. I just kind of wish we saw more of them, right? That's my general thing here. And then we get to see Sphinx speaking to Priscilla for pretty much the whole next chapter. It's interesting though, because Sphinx goes over some things and all that sort of shit to Priscilla. And Priscilla here actually seems slightly more vulnerable than usual. Like, she felt like this on occasion with EX5, but this is a moment where we get to see a little bit of a more vulnerable Priscilla and like admitting some things of like herself not being absolutely the strongest, right? All that sort of shit. But Sphinx makes an interesting comment that I currently don't know yet because I haven't read the side stories, but she implies that this whole thing is related to Priscilla herself, or rather Priscilla mentions the fact that it's like, oh, your whole involvement here is my own fault, right? Like that's me, that's my issue. And that's an interesting dialogue moment to me, mainly because, okay, I haven't read the side stories, but I do know the general thing of, I believe the dude who ends up becoming one of Priscilla's many husbands picks up Sphinx after the whole battle in EX2. So I'm assuming the implication there is something that happened there with Priscilla and him, possibly Sphinx, whatever it may be. Something around that led to the moment where, you know, this was the issue, right? Like, this is what led Sphinx to being here, having this happen, all this sort of shit. Don't know yet, right? At the current moment, I don't know. I probably don't want to know, just in case it is locked behind all these side stories, so I will get to them eventually. It's just like, especially the Priscilla ones, right? Because that's something I definitely need to read if I want to get a better grasp at a lot of the story here with Al and her, all that sort of shit. So, obviously I'll get to that. But it is a thing of like, oh, okay, so I guess there's something there behind that. And then we also have Arakia going nuts, and the reason behind that is Arakia ate Muspel, or like that's the very clear implication of that. So that's interesting. She took that in, and now she is just beaming the shit out of that location, and I could make a very clear reference here. I really could, but you know, I feel like last time we made a reference to this, and in my notes for the previous volume I made a reference to the same series, so I think this time I should really avoid making the reference again, because this is just going to become the new One Piece sort of thing, right, where I go like, oh, to compare it to One Piece, and you know, I feel like that's a little fucked up, because I don't want to constantly compare it to super popular shows, especially ones that people haven't always seen, especially one that definitely, you know, even though it's super popular, I don't know that everybody has necessarily seen it, right, or wants to see it, or whatever it may be. So I think it's fucked up if I make references like that, but I'm just saying, you know. Anyways, the more important thing is we cut back to Yorna, Iris, and this fight is a wash for Rowan, right? He is fucked here. It is very clearly just, no, he is screwed, right? No matter how many times he gets up, Yorna just hits him back, hits him with her tail. I kind of forgot that Kitsune can, most of the time in actual like fiction and all this sort of shit, Their tails are actually strong, right? Despite, being these like, oh, soft, fluffy looking things. No, they can slap with that, right? They can hit hard. At least that's what, always happens with them in fiction. Most of the time. Most. But Yorna, or rather Iris, it's hard to say. I really want to say Yorna just because of the whole thing, but I mean, Iris is correct. It's fucked up. Anyways, Iris beats his ass and Rowan gets an idea. He fucking stabs his neck. He kills himself. And this... now I'm going to say Yorna. Now I am going to say Yorna for a specific reason. Yorna runs over and tries to save him. And Rowan just gets back up. Black eyes, yellow pupils, all that sort of shit. Multiple of him dashing straight towards her. Guess we'll see how that fight is gonna go. But I do like that development with Yorna there. Because that is the moment that you see her go from Iris back to Yorna. And I like that a lot. Right? That is really damn good. I like this return to form. That just because Rowan essentially killed himself, right? He injured himself and she didn't want that to happen, right? The whole point of this fight was that she was knocking him back so he'd fuck off, right? So he would flee, get out of the city, right? That was her whole plan. So when he kills himself, it's an immediate thing of, oh no, and she runs over. Because it's still, the child logic, right? I love that. I really hope nothing bad happens to her from here. It's very clear, Rowan's fucked, right? Rowan's fucked, he's not coming back. That's it. He's dead, right, at this point. But I just hope Yorna doesn't suffer the same fate. She shouldn't, hopefully, because, she's one of 9 divine generals, but you never know, right? You never fucking know. Tenza hopefully shows up here. I hope. But then we get the finale to it, which is Garfield shows up to help out Heinkel. Not really much to say here, he just helps out everything. It's nice. I like it. And we also have the side story to this, where we see more about Ubilk and how Katya gets to be an absolute fucking champ and change history just by speaking to him and giving him, this proper motivation and everything. I love that she does that. It's real great. We also get to see more of Rem and everything, and she's worried about, Subaru, but she's trusting him with finishing this off correctly. Love that shit. And that's also, like I said, where they mentioned the final battle stuff. But because that stuff over there, I forgot to mention this little piece. Because that place over there where they're at is also being affected by the fight right now. Possibly because of Vollachia. Now it's this thing of now both sides are kind of, dealing with shit. So it's this thing of Tenza very easily could just be okay, you know what, let me go help out. And then just interacts with Yorna. That'd be fantastic. Overall, very good volume. Here's the interesting thing I would say, right? I mentioned this in my notes, but here's what I would say. It's pretty interesting about it. This volume is the weakest of Arc 8 so far. With that said, with the exception to, I would say, the 3rd, 4th, and I believe 6th volume of Arc 7, this is still better than the rest of the volumes of Arc 7. This is still way better. I still enjoy this arc more, right? And I know it's weird to say that because these are technically 2 in the same arc, but I feel like it's important to say that, to just mention I had problems with Arc 7 between its really weird decision to lock certain story details behind side chapters and all that, the side story type of stuff, and massive recaps for volumes. This chapter had recaps and very dialogue focused chapters, but you know what the difference was? This volume kind of focused on developing things more, right? It focused on pushing things ahead more. The final volume to Arc 7 wasn't very good because it was literally just, okay, here's where, Chiza is and Bursets and all this sort of shit. Here's where Vincent and all of them are. But on top of that, here's where Subaru is and all this. And it's why do we need just every fucking chapter of that to be here's where everybody is, right? I didn't like that very much. That kind of annoyed me because it was just it legitimately kind of made me think. And I hate to think about this for a series I love so much. It legitimately made me sit there and think, why am I reading this? Right? I could just read a chapter from like Arc 8, from like chapter 1 of Arc 8, right? And probably get enough context of where everybody's at from there to know what's going on. Yeah, definitely there would probably be stuff I'd miss out on here and there, but it is at such a degree with that final volume of Arc 7 that it's just like, dude, I could just fucking skip ahead and we'd have no problem, right? I had problems with it because they just kind of placed people around everywhere and we're like, okay, let's talk about why they're here. This volume feels way better because there's always development in some manner. Yeah, it's not always like perfect. There's sometimes just chapters of who's going where and whatever it may be, but they're very finite in amount, right? They're very small. Whereas a lot of other chapters in the volume, super good, right? They're developed. There's a lot of big things happening in them. Keeps me interested. It's great. This volume is really damn good. Even if it's the weakest out of the arc so far, it is really damn good. And I like that. This volume is fantastic. I am excited to see what happens next, right? Like, Teppei is back to cooking, right? This is the thing that I want to mention, is I think one of my problems with Arc 7, technically speaking, was that it was my first time, being caught up to a volume arc release, whatever the fuck we want to call it, and reading it felt like a pain sometimes because of what I mentioned, right? The side story locking stuff, the massive recaps, all this sort of stuff. So it felt like shit because it's like, wow, my first time doing this, where I get to read this as it comes out, essentially, rather as it's translated by the WCT. Thank you, WCT. We'll continue to support. Anyways, main point is I get to read it as it comes out and all this sort of shit.
It's exciting, but it didn't feel exciting for Arc 7 because it was just like,
oh, it's not that good sometimes. It's very good sometimes, and then sometimes it's not. This is different. This is good. I am happy to read this, and now, because there's already new chapters coming out, I get to be caught up and read it more, right? And that's something I'm actually going to do, is I'm going to read it more as it comes out. So the next section of the big video is essentially going to be not long from this one. But yeah, that's it for this volume. So believe it or not much happens in the first two chapters. We get the essential just start to the Garfield and Midoriya fight, and we learn that Subaru has already used Return by Death. We don't really see how or anything like that. Hell, if we're being real here, we don't see it at all throughout this entire volume, which is a very interesting choice. Not even in a bad way, I mean that in a fully good way. It's very interesting to see this scenario where he's already died before and is restarting, but now we're kind of seeing the events unfold from the good loop.
The only thing I don't like about it is it kind of fucks over the whole thing that, people have where they keep count of every time that he's looped, or like the amount of times that they mention. And right now, we can only say there's been one, but we don't know if there's been multiple. So that's the only thing. But other than that, the first chapter kind of just discusses, that, as well as, Halle Bell has to handle this much greater opponent, who we learn later on, and we'll get to that, of course. And then the chapter after is just explaining, okay, here's where everybody's fights are. And this one really hurt me, because seeing where all these fights were set up, it's like, okay, I have a general idea. I did have to rely on some of the comments in the WCT website, which, thank you, by the way, for the people down there essentially explaining what each of the lines were. That really helped. But one of them I did not need an explanation on, and it was Tanza. This one, just seeing her line, seeing the whole thing of like, finally and all this, it hurt, because I knew exactly what was going to happen from there. I'm like, oh yeah, no, of course she's going to fight Iris. Yeah. That's going to be a painful chapter. That's going to, especially with me, that's going to hurt. That's going to really hurt to read. But yeah, with that said, the first two chapters, pretty simple in that regard. And then we get interesting sort of scenarios here with learning more about Priscilla's kind of thing, where she sees something in Sphinx's staff, which I'm curious about. And then we get Yorna's section, or Iris, where this is really interesting. She's trying to fight Rowan, and she is really struggling, because this is what makes Iris so interesting, and Yorna and all that, is she's stuck in the past, but also trying to live in the present. And the two kind of try to blend together. And instead of creating this perfect middle ground for her, where she has tranquility with all this and everything, it is a fucked up homunculus where she cannot figure out what to do, right? She's trying to fight him and trying to do the least amount of damage possible, even if at this point he's already dead, right? He's already killed himself. But at the same time, she's kind of having difficulty with that sort of thing, and as a result, she's getting hurt real bad, until Tanza steps into the fight and just smacks Rowan away. And this is where we get to the difficult part, because now we have the next chapter. There was a fucking reason why, when I was talking about that one Arc 7 volume, I think it was volume 31, there was a reason why I said I'm probably going to enjoy Tanza a whole lot, and it's why I put her so high, right? I had a feeling she was going to be a great character, and I know there was some odd reactions to that, because it was just like, we barely know shit about Tanza and you're putting it that high. I just had very high expectations for her, right? I was right to have those expectations. This chapter that I'm going to talk about here is, and I mentioned it in my notes, I truly rarely ever say the word peak, right? I'm not really huge on a lot of terms that get used. I fucking hate the term mid, especially because it just gets thrown around willy-nilly, and people always use it to just bash on other series, and then also proceed to say, oh, don't bash on my series, your series is mid. And it's like, my brother, you are doing the same fucking thing. But, words like that I'm not huge on and everything, and even peak, that's used a lot, and it's to a degree where I'm like, there are peak moments with series, but I don't think everything is, completely flawless and all that. But here's the thing. I think for singular points, there are places where you could, use the word. This is somewhere where you can use it. Because, oh my lord, this chapter. Tanza's backstory and all this stuff with her and her sister, and how her sister dies, and her meeting Yorna, and Yorna saying, I don't like this country either, all this, right? Tanza being afraid to say those thoughts, but Yorna kind of pulls it out of her and fully, reciprocates it. And then Yorna trying to act cold and being like, oh, get out, right? And just grabbing her by the collar of her clothes. And Tanza fighting back, knowing that she's like turned into a bad child essentially, right? And she's fighting back, and she can tell Yorna's not smiling, right? Her biggest thing is, this would be fine. You know, all of us want Yorna to be happy. If this means that she can live with this person, Yugurd, and she'll be happy and all that, by all means she can do that. She's not smiling. And she starts using the soul marriage technique and goes, nah, I can tell. You're not happy with this. You're not happy with the fight, like the fact that you have to fight me. You're not happy with any of this. You aren't abandoning us. I can tell. And then just smacks Rowan away. Like, it is a beautiful chapter. This makes me love Tanza so much. This makes me love the complexity of Yorna so much. I'm calling her Yorna now because this is a scenario, right? I will call her differently depending on what scenario we are in. But I love these two characters. I am probably, when we do the tier list with the next volume, because I think that's what's going to happen, the fuck just happened to me? I'm not even going to edit that out. I was gonna edit that out. I flipped upside down. I did nothing. I touched nothing. The camera can do that? That took me completely out of thought there. Hold on. It can do that? How did I do that? I'm curious. I don't know. Whatever. If it happens again, it'll be interesting. Regardless. Anyways, what I was saying. I'm going to change it how I refer to her depending on the scenario. But when we get to the whole volume, like, review, essentially, right? Not volume review, arc review. Sorry. The camera flipping took me out of it. And I talk about, you know, all the characters that I've enjoyed, all this sort of shit, right? How I'm going to rank them on the tier list, because that's what we're going to do probably. Especially if the volume cover for the next one is a spoiler. I will probably change up how we're doing it, much like I did with Arc 7, where it's part of the full review instead of a smaller one. I might just put it part of the full one just because, right? That might be easier. Just for the sake of, oh yeah, here's the timestamp, guys. I'm not going to do 2 uploads. Here's just one, and then, you know, there's the review. Might just do it that way because it's easier. But when we do that, I'm probably going to have an updated tier list. I'm probably not going to go in and actually fully, you know, go through it. But, I mean, I might. But at the same time, if I don't, I think Yorna and Tenza are going to rise super hard. They have been my favorite characters in these 2 arcs. They are the best, and for a lot of reasons that I both can and can't talk about, right? There's a lot of shit I can't talk about project related, and because of the sad circumstance of the previous video, you all now know a lot more about the project, which I will get to at the end of the video, because, you know, we have more to discuss regarding that. But there's stuff I can and can't discuss regarding it, but I love these 2 as characters. So this chapter was beautiful to me. I loved it. It's not the, like, best chapter of the arc, because I still think that goes to, like, the Spica chapter, like, that whole thing. And there's also the chapter with, like, Subaru and Todd, and, like, you know, the Rem line and everything. Like, I love that chapter a lot. There's a lot here with Arc 8, but this chapter's pretty damn good. I think I would rate it pretty damn high in terms of Arc 8. It probably would be number 3, if not, like, at the bare minimum in top 5, right? And then the next 3 chapters are pretty much the conclusion to the Yugurd fight. The first one doesn't really start off with much. I mean, it's cool action, but overall, it's not that much that happens, really. It's kind of just the only thing that I was able to note down with it was the fact that, oh, I didn't even realize Wolfman fighting Yugurd. And Wolfman, person, not really, I mean, the exact person, but people responsible for killing his wife. Same with the mole people, who aren't in this fight, but I wish there was somebody who was related to that in here. I don't think Groovy is at all. I'm pretty sure he's just Squirrel, or something of relation to that. But I mean, if he was mole related, it'd be perfect. And then anyways, we get the continuation of, you know, Yugurd's kind of character and learning more about him. His curse
isn't really something he's inflicting on others, rather it was inflicted to him, and now it gets just spread onto others as a result, right? He doesn't feel it because of, what he was born with, but others do. And despite that, Iris still, fell in love with him and was close to him and all this sort of shit, which is really sweet. It does make you feel really bad for him. It's just also a thing of, this is also a fucked up scenario for Iris / Yorna, because look at what she now has, right? She's kind of moved past things in a way. But you also just later on get, oh, here's Groovy going for the Fiend Sword, but because it hates him and everything, he gets tossed up, Hallibell gets it, there, your good goes. Presumably. He might still be around a little bit. We might see him with the next volume, and, Iris might talk to him, but overall, that's it. It was a very cool fight all around. I love seeing Hallibell's tricks, and then seeing him get countered, because this is, quite the tough opponent to go against. But overall, pretty good. Pretty good. I actually like how Teppei, kind of concluded Yugur's character here, despite how little we essentially knew about him, right? We were able to learn enough that he was interesting. So again, I'm going to bunch up my thoughts on the next 2 chapters, but not the third one, even though these all relate to each other, because of how this was. So now we get the Balroy fight, right? And the overall thing here is like, okay, he goes outside, and then, oh shit, here comes the Roswell and Medium. And we also learned with this, that, like from Flop, that, oh, Balroy wouldn't just recklessly destroy everything because he knows, Flop is there, Medium is there, and he doesn't want to hurt them. And we get this fight between them, right, and all this sort of shit. We get a little bit more building of Balroy's character, right? Learn more about him, all this sort of shit. But here's the thing, right? I put this down in my notes as well. I like the action in this series, right? Love it. I like the character building in this series. Love that too. These chapters were really hefty, and not in a good way, because a lot of it kind of just felt a lot just stacked on top of each other, and there wasn't enough that was super intriguing. There's a reason I have the 3rd chapter separated, because I'll talk about that one. I'll talk about what makes that one very entertaining. The action here was decent. The character building was decent, but it didn't really feel like there was that much that really kept me interested with it, if I'm being honest, right? I know there's some people who might have really enjoyed these chapters. I just wasn't super huge on them, which is totally fine, right? That doesn't take down my opinion of the volume or anything like that. I mean, it does to a certain degree, but perfect way to look at it is this. Arc 6, the final volume of that, is my favorite volume in all of Arc 6, which, by the way, favorite arc of literally any series, just as a reminder. And also, in case you didn't know, because you might not have seen the review, which is fair enough. But, here's the thing. That volume also has a fight, like the Julius fight, where I like certain moments of it, right? I like him reforming the contract, and I like the moment where he reforms his oath to Anastasia. But overall, I'm not huge on that fight, which sucks. I really like Reed. I really like Julius. That fight was okay. I wasn't huge on it, but I still love that volume. And that's still the thing here. As much as I find this part of the fight to be, alright, it's still a thing of, that doesn't necessarily ruin the volume for me, right? It's just a small, kind of nitpicking sort of thing where I'm like, this could have been done better. But then we get the final chapter to the fight. And this one, I love. This one was done super well. Like, unlike the Julius fight that I mentioned, right? That one has moments where it's great, but the conclusion to the fight doesn't even feel fully satisfying. Ooh, this one. So, Roswell, of course, tries to find tactics to, fuck with Balroy. I also forgot to mention, actually, let me make a side note here. I wasn't huge on the fact that the chapter in between this one and the first kind of just ends in the same place that the first one ends.
as much as, yeah, they're giving exposition for Balroy and his character, it's a little fucked up to just kind of be like, oh yeah, wait, no, here's the same end spot after you've read for like 20 or half an hour, right? A little fucked up. Anyways, going back to this, and this great chapter, this one's different though. Roswell, of course, you know, finds the means to distract him, so, oh, here's a bunch of ice coming in, which fucks with Balroy, because it's like, oh, he's trying to shoot Medium's, like, arm, essentially, to incapacitate her, and, like, she'll be okay, yeah, she'll be injured, but she can't fight back, and then I will kill the other dude, right? That's his strategy. So here comes a bunch of ice to fuck with him, right? Now he has to focus on evading all of that, while also trying to attack and everything, which Medium is still, like, you know, slashing out of the way. It's great. And then he comes up with the great strategy of, yeah, you know what, here's more fire. And a bunch of fire just comes storming down with the ice towards the Crystal Palace. And Balroy realizes, oh shit, oh, Sphinx is in there. And also, you know, like, Madeline and all that, but, like, specifically Sphinx. Sphinx dies, he's fucked, right? So it's like, oh shit, okay, time to stop all of that. And it tries to stop all that. And then we get the next part of the strategy, which is Roswell previously being told by Julius how to deal with him, essentially, right? Some details get, you know, excluded because Julius doesn't want to discuss everything, but he has the general knowledge of the technique. So here comes a giant rainbow, which Balroy isn't even fully familiar with. I didn't even think about it, but yeah, I guess he would be affected by gluttony. Most people would be. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, of course he would. So here comes the giant rainbow, and now he's got to deal with that, and he manages to get a shot right into the back of Roswell, who, you know, now injured and all that. Oh, this is very easy to handle. He'll bleed out and die, and then Medium he can catch before she falls down and everything. And Roswell just grabs Medium, and the sly piece of shit that he is sometimes lifts her up, boom, and chucks her right to the ground. And that doesn't seem like that big of a problem. I mean, it could be. Very easily could be. They're pretty high up in the air, you know. Even if he goes down to catch her, there could be some risks, but he could catch her, except for the fact that all that ice that stormed down earlier had a second operation to it, which was creating a bunch of spikes on the floor. So now, Balroy has to choose. He either finishes off Roswell, or breaks those spikes, and Medium lives. He, of course, despite being a zombie, chooses the spikes. So, shoots the spikes, and his life is ended, because Roswell is still A-okay. Sly motherfucker. You know, I should have known he would have done something like this, but ooh, that was smart. Not the best move, but smart. And then into the next chapter, we get an interesting scenario, because Garfield was fighting Missoria, right? And he took a heavy hit the last time we saw him. And now he's kind of in a state where he's dying. Somewhat. We'll get to that. But the whole thing is he's watching a play of these cats fighting that are all dressed in a manner of, like, you know, symbolizing him, Heinkel, and Missoria. And also, I think the implication is that they look similar to Puck, is like the full explanation there, right? Because, I mean, they start wording them as Pucks later on, so I think that's the full implication of it. But then more and more people start surrounding him, not even just his friends and everything, but like enemies, all this sort of shit, everybody that he's known, right? And it's this slow realization of what he has to do, and all this, and I love it, right? It's Garfield fully, you know, going through his subconscious, seeing these versions of his friends, talking to them, figuring out what he has to do, and as soon as he has this plan in mind, he knows exactly what he needs to do to break through. Once he's figured out what to do, I really love it. You get this perfect, you know, retread of the Arc 5 scene where Kurgan just looks at him and goes like, "Oh, magnificent." And that's it. That's all he says. And that, I love that. I love that that's redone there. And, you know, Garfield goes through this whole thing with his friends, everything finally snaps out of it, gets back in the fight. It's good. And then he had, as I worded in my notes, he so long gave Bowser's Mizoria right into a building, which is real great. Some people said that they don't enjoy this chapter because it's super long for just going through Garfield's mind and everything. But I don't know, I really like it. I like that it's this full delve into his subconscious and kind of talks more about what he thinks in his mind, this scenario for him. The fact that a lot of this is not just his friends, but there's his enemies, and the play going on is very similar to a play that he loved of the subjugation of the white whale. I love it. I really do. I think this is a cool chapter that delves a lot more into him, and I really like it for that reason. And then again, we get another beautiful chapter where we learn a whole lot all at once. We see this scenario where it's like, oh, Reed was killing and eating a bunch of dragons. They kept trying to fight him out of the sake of pride. They didn't give a shit about each other, but it was for the sake of their own pride, and tried to fight him, and then just died. So they're like, oh shit, well now we have to, figure out what are we doing. And some of them kind of just fucked off and created these dragon kin, which is what Madeline is. But essentially, it forms a husk of the previous, dragon, and creates a child who is more human in a sense, right? They're still a dragon, but they're also more human as a result. Very clear thing with this is Volcanica probably also has that kind of scenario. I saw people saying, oh, that probably means why, he recognized Patrichet, and it's like, well, here's the thing with that. I would agree if it worked for the fact that she's just a dragon, right? She's a ground dragon. We don't fully know the whole lore behind, Dragonkin. There might be more to it that we don't know yet, but the thing is, if there's no real human features to her other than ground dragon, I don't know that that's her. I don't know that that's what she is. It could be interesting, but I don't know that that's necessarily true just yet, right? We get the continuation of the fight where Mizoria almost blows up the Crystal Palace, and, fucking Madeline inside of Mizoria is, freaking the fuck out because she almost just killed the person she loves, which, speaking of which, we learn more about that, and how it's a weird kind of scenario. It works very well, right? I'm calling it weird. It works very well. I like it. Where Balroy rescued her, and she was, a child while he was older, which already sounds bad. Don't worry. In case this is your first time hearing about this and you haven't actually read the volume, Tepe gives a very good explanation for this. Balroy sees her when she's a child and kind of helps her out and tries to take her out of there. He even fights Mizoria and all that. And because of this scenario where Balroy is teaching her and doing all this for her and just essentially trying to get her to live a normal life, she develops feelings for him. And these feelings very clearly aren't fully reciprocated. There's a lot of reasons really for it, but I guess the main thing that's clear is Balroy most likely likes, medium, right? That's the person he viewed as this person he would marry. So it's kind of this thing of, yeah, Madeline has these feelings because this is somebody she looks up to a lot. So as a result, that's going to affect her heavily, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's an actual connection between the two. Sometimes it's really cool to do that concept when you do it like that. Sometimes they don't need to have a connection, because if they have a connection, sometimes it's a little weird. Maybe even more than that. But if it's like that, where there's just one path and the other doesn't really, it just bounces off, that's okay. But then we learn how she reacted after the fact of him dying. We learn how she receives her last name, because it's like, oh yeah, there was some rebels to the country that, were well known and all this sort of shit, which is a very weird last name to choose, because you are literally giving this last name of rebels who went against the royal family to this person who has every intention to also do so. So, little interesting to say that, right? A little interesting to just give her that, but okay, sure. We see how she generally reacted after he came back, all this sort of shit, as well as, speaking with Flop, which helps rekindle her feelings. And then once again, continuation of the fight and proper conclusion of it, where Garfield's doing well, but Mizorio kind of goes into the air and creates this massive attack that could just destroy the whole area. Except Garfield manages to just punch Mizoria, and this part I love, pretty much discusses that he would like to have a talk with Madeline. No just constant fighting, no seeing whichever one of them will fall first. Just a talk. Just a talk, just like he had in Arc 4 with Emilia and Subaru. Just a talk. And I love that. I love that his character has reached this point where it was once full aggression, and now he is fully willing to hear somebody out who was in a scenario that she was unsure of what to do. Right? I love that. This was a great chapter. I absolutely enjoy Balroy and Madeline more now, especially Madeline. Good shit. Good shit to pay. So next we get the conclusion to the Cecilis and Archaea fight, all that sort of stuff. I mean, Al's there too, of course, but he doesn't end up doing an insane amount as a result, because it's just, you know, Archaea exploding the whole area and then Cecilis counterattacking. Overall, the stuff here is cool. Like, I think it's very interesting, and it does make you feel bad to see Archaea wanting death. It's cool to see Cecilis talking to his essentially past self and remembering things, and remembering partially why Chiza had turned him into a kid and all this, and remembering Archaea to a certain degree. Right? There's certain things that are piecing back together in his mind. Not perfectly, but certain things. Al's sword fucking breaks, which is very unfortunate, but to be fair, it's not like it was a super special sword, at least to my understanding. I haven't fully gone through the side stories relating to him and the sword and all that yet. But overall, there's some cool stuff here, and there's even some good action. However, I mentioned this in my notes, once again, going through that. There's moments with Cecilis that feel very 50-50 for me. A lot of his scenes are like that, where they are fantastic, or they're a bit slow. Like, they kind of just go on and on and on. And this one is the latter. There is a lot here where, just like I mentioned before, a lot gets piled on top to the point that it feels draining, right? I don't feel like I fully want to read at some points. And there's some good there, but there's not enough interesting stuff for me to consistently go through it. Like, I think the end bit of the second chapter, and when I say end bit, I mean like a good chunk of the end, is pretty damn cool. And I think there's bits and pieces in there that are also really good. It's just a thing of, there's a lot of points with these chapters where it kind of just feels slow, right? And I'm not huge on that, because it's like, I don't always need to be entertained, right? I don't always need keys in my face, like, jangling around. But it is a thing of, if I want to keep reading, and I'm reading through a chapter that could be 10,000 words, 9,000 words, whatever it may be, I'm probably going to want at least 6,000 or so to be pretty damn entertaining. And when it feels like something like 3,000 or 2,000, that's not great. And then we have our final chapter, and this chapter delves into a few things. Olbert is snooping around the Crystal Palace and sees something. We don't know what that is yet. We'll probably learn with the next volume. We kind of learn a little bit more about these zombies and how they get deformed in grotesque ways with every time like they're rebuilt and all this sort of shit. It's like kind of gross to think about, and honestly kind of horrific to imagine being in that scenario. But then we have the biggest moment of all. Sphinx is by where like Subaru and the others are, you know, while they're doing the whole name aiding sort of thing and dealing with the zombies. Yeah, she's there. She knows about the authority of gluttony. She knows that it's being used, and she death beams Jamal. She's there. She's just fucking there now. I'm sure we might learn how and why and all that, but this is a very fucking cool twist where it's just, oh yeah, there's the antagonist. There she is. She's just here now. Oh shit. Right? And she's by the... I'm not gonna say like, oh, they're completely defenseless and all that. They can't do anything against her. But right now, a lot of the super strong people are split up, right? Everybody who's skilled, who's fast, all this, they're split up. And now, in this current area, like, yeah, we have Beatrice, who is strong, of course, right? Very skilled, all that. We have Subaru, who's making use of Spica, who is also pretty damn good. And we have Vincent, who, yeah, has some good, like, use to him, especially with the Yang Sword and all that. But this is kind of a thing. We're up against Sphinx here, right? Somebody who required Julius, Emilia, and Hallibel to fully stop in terms of that one blast. And then in terms of fighting, Garfield, Roswell, and Beatrice. This required like 6 people before. This is very scary that she's here now. But with that said, that's the volume. I am very intrigued to see where we go from here, because there's a lot that's concluding. There's a lot of final scenes that will probably happen with these zombies like Balroy. Ugard might talk to Iris, right, in the next volume. All this sort of shit. And Tenz is probably actually going to have a conversation with Yorna. I think there's a lot here that's going to happen. But on top of the fact of just Sphinx, right? I'm very curious to see what's happening there. I'm curious to see what Olbert saw. There's a lot that has me super intrigued now. And this time, I am going to read the next volume as the chapters are coming out. Specifically when they're translated, because I like to show my support. And also I haven't gone to spoilers on my feed in a while. So I'm A-okay in that regard. But very excited to see what that's about. But for now, I can definitely say I enjoyed this volume a lot. Thumbs up. I think it's like 3rd place so far out of the 4 volumes that are out. The previous volume, like last, not to say it was bad, it was still great, but it's like last, then there's this one, then there's the 1st volume of Arc 8, and then there's the 2nd. And the top 2 could actually possibly interchange. I just kind of put the 2nd above because it has the Spica chapter, which is, you know, one of, if not my favorite chapter so far in the series. Probably one of, I don't know that it's my favorite, but it's very easily a strong candidate for it. So we get to start off here with something real cool, and also something that really upset me at first, right? I know this will probably happen with this volume as well. Like, the fucked up thing is, I'm making this review, and I know this is probably going to happen when the volume actually releases for this, right? But I'll deal with it. Anyways, the more important thing is the chapter we have to talk about here, which isn't 61, believe it or not. It's the Sphinx and Witch interlude. The thing that dropped with the volume last time, and it upset me that this was dropping as a short story, because to pay, you shouldn't be doing that. Right? That's absurdly fucked up. Right? I am glad that this and the Ubil chapters have been re-released, you know, online and everything. You put them for everybody to see, right? That's really great. Big improvement from some of the stuff with Arc 7. But it's like, can we not? Right? If there's going to be something that is plot important, save it for a chapter. Don't just put like side story exclusive for the people who read the light novel, and then I will put it online later. Like that's kind of fucked up. Anyways, the Sphinx and Witch interlude pretty much goes more into what the previous volume ended on, which is, you know, Sphinx showing up in front of Subaru and the others. She really provides a hard time to them. Like, it's constant trial and error to try and, you know, deal with her, because she's very unpredictable. But it eventually leads to a point where Vincent's like, oh yeah, here's my Yang sword, boop, and just burns her and any copy of her that there is. Except, in the middle of doing that, Sphinx transforms and gains the appearance of Echidna, which is really interesting, because I noted it down as well, that there's now 2 Echidnas, essentially, in the form of, essentially, Ryuzu, right? How Ryuzu looks.
But the interesting thing is, I don't remember if Omega looks like Echidna, like it's supposed to look like her or anything, or if Omega kind of looks like the hybrid between them. Because if it's the latter, that actually makes Sphinx's scenario interesting, because Sphinx just straight up looks like her. Like, to me, that's kind of neat how the one who isn't Echidna would look like her the most, and the one who is, but is also this, like, you know, fusion of the sort, of course, ends up not looking as similar. I don't know. I would have to look more into that and everything, because I know there's a few Omega illustrations, but they don't really make it clear, because one makes it look like it is just a regular Ryuzu, and the other, from what I saw, makes it look like like either Echidna or it's a hybrid sort of thing. So, something I'll have to look into more. Then we get a very simple and short chapter, but I still like it. We get somebody on Sphinx's side kind of, you know, commanding all these troops to just go in, you know, rush and destroy the other side. And the other side is completely great, right, with their planning, mainly because of Subaru and his team, right, like the Pleiades battalion, all that. And then there's Ran, and there's Katma. I'm saying Ran because they imply it, but I don't think they ever drop, you know, her name or anything like that in there. And then, you know, Sphinx shows up to help out the dude, kind of trying to push in on the battalion and all that. And she's like, hey, I know something real cool we can do. Human extinction attack. I mean, I made a tweet about that, but I just find it really funny that just any time Sphinx is in a corner, anytime Sphinx is like, oh no, whatever will I do? It's pretty funny. I like that. It's a cool detail, and it does make things tense, but it also serves as good humor. Then we get more Tenza and Yorna, which, you know, I will completely take. Love these characters. And Tenza gets to go in protecting Yorna until the later part of the fight, where, you know, she's in a little bit of danger, and Ugard shows up, and he is no longer undead, presumably because of the curse sword. Well, to say that is incorrect. He is still undead, but he doesn't have the same features as the others, meaning his control is basically his own. It's not commanded by Sphinx, it's nothing like that. He has control over his body, but he is still undead. And there will come a point where his life kind of just expends, right? It's over, right? He's back to being in the grave, which is something we'll get to later with that final chapter. I will probably cover it briefly because there's a lot more to say about that final chapter. But I also like this chapter because obviously the big thing is, you know, Ugard and Emilia fighting Rowan, who eventually just runs away because he's being burned by, you know, the Yang Sword Vollachia. Keeps running, stumbles, and sees his son, who just finished fighting Arakia. But there's another part of this that I do like, which is the difference between Tenza and Ugard, where they aren't sure about each other and, you know, are confused, and then Yorna explains it to them, and Ugard's like, this kid's good, I like this kid, nice job. It's a sweet little interaction. I enjoy it a lot. But I'm glad that Ugard gets to be a cool character here, because, you know, if he was going to go out of his way and just, you know, hit Tenza or some shit, I was going to be like, alright, fuck this guy, but I'm glad he's great. And then we get a chapter about Sisyllus fighting his father. Now, this chapter was a big improvement compared to the previous Sisyllus fight, right? The previous one, I was okay with. There were a lot of moments where it kind of felt like it was going on, and I was getting a little bored. But this one was great. I actually read this one, felt completely entertained. That was real good. Here's the thing though, it does get kind of overshadowed by Al here. Al mentions two things in specific that I want to point out. And one, it's presumable father issues with him. The stuff where Sisyllus talks about his father, and then Al kind of has some problems or something like that. It's weird to word it, but he makes some comments that lead you to believe, oh, there might be more going on then, right? So I'm curious about that. I mean, I think everybody is kind of curious about Al's past, and I think this really makes you wonder what's going on. But number two is Sphinx shows up, right?
And as soon as she does, Al starts screaming like Echidna's name at her while trying to go and attack. The interesting thing about this is the fact that he knows who Echidna is, right? So he knows who Echidna is. He knows who Satella is because of Arc 7, right? That whole thing. So we now know that he knows who these characters are, you know, all this sort of shit. He has some link with them. I think he even mentions teacher in the following chapter or something like that. So that also could be interesting. Like I said, I'm just going off memory for that because I don't entirely remember. I will probably check my notes in a second and, you know, see if that's the case. But it's interesting. I'm very curious now to learn more about Al. Like I always was, but the more and more we see about him, I get more curious, right? It's kind of the thing of like, for example, Arc 3, right? We have him talking about Rem and like mentioning, oh, she has a sister, all that, like, okay. Or not, she has a sister, but more so, Rem is the sister, and then there's, you know, Rem, who he knows, and he feels disgusted by that in some way, and it's like, what's that supposed to mean, right? I'm very, very curious to see what all this is about. But I was indeed correct. Al does refer to Echidna as teacher, which once again, very interesting. But we get a lot with this next chapter, where we learn more about Sphinx's motivation for, you know, this whole plan and everything. And part of it is dealing with Priscilla, right? She wants some revenge, which we'll get into later. There's a lot of cool stuff where Sphinx, you know, sends down a star essentially, which they mentioned that Echidna pretty much said, oh yeah, it's ideal to not use more than once, and Cecilius just splits it in half, because fucking, of course he can. Al makes a prosthetic, like, arm out of the earth, essentially, and just slams it into Sphinx. And the big part about this entire thing, is Archaea. Sphinx is kind of aiming for Archaea at the moment. Not the other two. I mean, getting rid of the other two helps, but mainly her, because she is essentially now Muspel. And that means, if she dies, the whole empire goes down. There isn't some, like, oh, well, that's okay, because then the spirit will go back into the... No. The whole thing's dead. Because, you know, spirit eater. But still, it's a thing of, okay, we can't let her die, or we're fucked. And as Sphinx is about to do her the final tactic here, I guess is the way to word it, she gets stopped by Subaru and Beatrice, which we will get into shortly. So I don't have too much to say for these next two chapters, other than we now know about the Crystal Palace a little bit more and how, oh yeah, spirits kind of just made up this whole thing, right? It's kind of like, oh yeah, we took all these spirits and we just kind of shoved them in there. And now we have this. They might have talked about that in the past and I just don't remember, but I know they, you know, really emphasized it here, so I took note of it now, if they did mention it before. And then also the cannon fire that Sphinx was going to use as her big final tactic with Al and all them gets taken, essentially. You know, Beatrice kind of opens up a portal, closes it, and goes, we'll use that for later, that's a secret tool. And then we also get the next chapter where Sphinx is just, you know, going crazy. We get Vincent and Ugard fighting alongside each other, which is really cool to see, right? Two Yang swords duking it out, except not against each other, against everybody else. Guess that's not really the correct way to phrase it, but that's okay. And also, we will talk about that whole type of scenario. Two Yang swords, yeah, we'll talk about that more later. And then we get the nice finale to this chapter, which has a cold, like, sting to it, of Amelia asking why Echidna is there, right? Because to her, she doesn't see Ryuzu or anything like that, or Sphinx. She sees Echidna, because that's what Sphinx looks like right now. And Sphinx, fittingly, throws it back in her face by wondering why the Witch of Envy is here. Because, similarly, she has no fucking idea who Amelia is. She just sees Amelia and goes, oh shit, that's Satella. Why is she here? And then we also learn more about the current predicament that everybody is in. And that's
the Empire is basically going to blow up. Inevitably. Like, it's kind of the thing of the scenario they're in right now is pretty much fucked, especially with Muspel and all that, which is something I don't think they've fully elaborated on as of yet, I don't think, because I think that's something they have to talk about more, maybe with a, unfortunately, side story, or perhaps the start of the next arc. I mean, we haven't seen everybody left yet, right, or whatever it may be, like we haven't seen them leaving, all that sort of shit. I'm just holding out hope, because I do really like this arc, but I do think, similarly to what people have pointed out, there are a few things missing that needed to be wrapped up. But anyways, more important thing. The whole Empire is inevitably going to blow up, right, because of the whole scenario with Muspel and all that, as well as just a whole bunch of other shit. And this is actually part of Sphinx's goal, because if she blows up the Empire, that essentially extends the range of her spell, and it can go further and further and further, right? The whole point of it is to constantly expand the spell until eventually everything is just zombies, pretty much. And Olbert and I'm why am I forgetting his name now? The big metal man Moguro, I want to say. I could be wrong. That might be wrong. I might be making an embarrassment with my remembering names here when I'm usually so good with it. It's okay. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Anyways, those two are at death's door. So we are now going to have 7 Divine Generals. And Medium and Flop and Balroy all come to help out Vincent. Because, you know, right now he's with Olbert and Moguro, and he's trying to, you know, essentially deal with this situation, especially because, you know, the others were trying to fight Sphinx there and everything. We didn't actually get the continuation of Emilia and Sphinx, but there's not too much to say other than this is where, you know, the general plan is kind of laid out more, and it's the obvious thing of, okay, there's this plan, and then there's also the thing for getting revenge against Priscilla, right? And then we do get a really good chapter. Like, I'm not even going to make jokes similarly to my notes. I'm not going to make any jokes here or anything like that. Of Balroy and Madeline, essentially. Talking about them more, establishing them more, showing bits and pieces of their, you know, past, whatever it may be, as well as, like, current scenario. And it's kind of interesting, right? I want to note this chapter as interesting. We have already seen Balroy's send-off, technically, right? We saw it in EX4. We saw him die there and everything. But this chapter in this arc is a really good send-off for him. You know, him taking the core of Moguro and kind of just flying straight up, right? And just boom. And having Madeline, you know, see that and essentially break down and all that. It hits hard. It hits hard. I worded it in my notes, I believe, and I mean, even now, I'm feeling it a bit. But it was hard to really, like, contain myself. It was, I felt like I was gonna legitimately tear up super hard. I could feel that shit, and I was in, like, you know, complete, like, public and everything, so I didn't want to be, like, you know, sitting there looking at my phone and kind of just crying and everything. It's like, you know, I don't know, it would attract a little bit, like, too much attention to it to a point where it's like, I'm just crying. But, yeah, it's a really good chapter. I love this chapter a lot. It's not my favorite of this volume. It's probably second. Maybe third. I don't know if there's anything else I'm forgetting, but I think second. I think absolutely second. But it's still really damn good for being second, even if there's a chapter that I believe tops it, and I mean, we'll get there at the end of this. But still, this really did some justice to Balroy. It really did some justice to Madeline. You might have noticed on my tier list that I posted, both of them went up pretty damn hard. Because they're great now. That they're
really great characters. I like them a lot. So the next chapter, we have a bunch of people fighting Sphinx once again. Now, part of this is Cecilus being big. I don't remember when Cecilus became big, right? It could have happened off screen. It could have happened in a chapter and I just didn't notice. There's a lot of scenarios for this. I just didn't notice it at all. So, a little unfortunate for me, but he's big now. That's cool. And everybody's still fighting Sphinx. Sphinx is, still trying to deal with them, but getting desperate. And there's 7 Sphinxes essentially. There's one they're dealing with. There's another with Priscilla, who they've now determined is not in the Crystal Palace at all. And then there's 5 other ones. Now, these 5 remaining Sphinxes are like, well, you know what, fuck this. Ultimate tactic. We shall use the magic circles here to destroy this whole place. That's all we need to do. And as they try to use them, it's then revealed that out of safety, Emilia kind of went to these circles and just destroyed them. So, those can't even be used either. Then we get a great chapter of Al and Subaru, helping each other out while trying to deal with Sphinx. Subaru kind of motivating Al on, and Al essentially gaining the encouragement needed to just rush in and help him out. The cannon fire from before that Beatrice was like, oh yeah, we're going to save for later. Another star gets dropped, and Beatrice is like, cool, now! But that essentially destroys the star entirely. And then we get Priscilla's return to battle, because she essentially burns the entire alternate space that she's in. Now, if you're going into this, essentially hearing these spoilers, you haven't actually read the volume or anything like that, you might be wondering, well, okay, so if she burns that whole alternate space where her and that copy of Sphinx is, right, everything's burned, and then she can finally come out of that prison. How exactly does she survive that? We'll get to that. But, in the meantime, Priscilla returns. She gives, everybody the flame in their eye to protect them, right, the whole soul marriage technique. And then also calls Subaru by name, which I really like, right? Even though still looks like a kid and everything, she calls him by name. Or rather, she calls him by name when addressing him in the prison. Like, right, she's giving praise to him, her brother, and then Al. And then when she returns down, she gives Subaru permission to call her by name, which is pretty damn good. I actually really like this chapter. Now, the next chapter is kind of, delving more into that whole thing of her burning that whole space, seeing the fight going on, all that sort of shit. She even actually has a real great comment in there that I really like, of her essentially asking her brother in her mind to just find somebody to be happy with, right? Like, that's what she wants. Which is, it hits a lot harder now, right? It hits a lot harder knowing. Like, I had a feeling when I was reading, right, with all the art I was seeing and everything, I had a feeling, especially because people were pointing out the previous volume cover, I had a feeling, but it hits a lot harder now hearing that comment, because it's like, she knew what she had to do. But it hurts, but yeah. But then when she makes it to the surface and everything, Sphinx kind of does a whole like rain sort of attack, and Priscilla, the same with the soul marriage technique and all that, uses that to essentially protect everybody around, as well as dealing with Sphinx as well, in succession essentially. Now, chapter 73, I don't have too much to say about. However, it is still really good. The reason I don't have much to say about it is that, there's a lot that happens, but there's not a lot that I can necessarily kind of pinpoint in here and speak about, because a lot of it is action, as you would expect in this moment. It is fighting, because that is the point that we're at, right? Like, for the most part, and I'll, establish this more a little bit later, because we're going to talk about the next chapter. But, for the most part, it's going to be action, because they're not going to sit down and talk with Sphinx again. But overall, this chapter is really damn good with that action. The two things that I can point out with it
are, I mentioned earlier, the double Yang swords. Now we got the triple Yang swords, right? Priscilla's helping out her brother and ancestor fight the Crystal Palace monster, essentially. And Sphinx in this chapter is also really great. I really fucking love that she starts yelling to Priscilla that she's her opponent, right? It feels real good to see. Like, I like it a lot. It makes this interesting scenario where it's like, oh yeah, Sphinx is trying to really just force and establish this. As well as, like, we learn more about Sphinx and, you know, her past and all that. Not really her past, but the time between EX2 and this, right? Which I know there are side stories and stuff like that about. I will get to them eventually. But it is a thing of, like, and especially now after the finale, I probably will. But we actually get to see Sphinx's scenario here of, you know, how her life was, everything like that. And it's really interesting, like, despite being in such a fucked scenario, she kind of treated it as something that was, like, good, technically. Well, maybe not good more so, but, like, this thing that's, like, you know, the sparks for curiosity and all this sort of shit. And then the events that, like, essentially create Priscilla happen. Then we get a cool conclusion to this whole fight on both sides. Because we have Subaru and we have Priscilla. And by both of them are a ton of people, right? Like, I legitimately love stuff like this where, you know, everybody just kind of comes in to help out, right? And then, like, deal with the final foe. And with Subaru's side, they're protecting him because I knew this could happen. I knew Spica could do this. Spica and Subaru brought Sphinx to the Hall of Memories. That proves that she can do that. I knew that it was possible because even though she's a different person now, essentially, I knew that was possible. And that's exactly what they do. They even say happy birthday and then take her name. But, or presumably, that's the implication of it. And then we have, you know, Priscilla's side dealing with the Crystal Palace and all that, as well as, I think, another copy of Sphinx, because I believe they, like, list her in there. But it's kind of this great scenario where, just like Subaru and having everybody protect him from one of the Sphinxes, Priscilla is fighting that plus the palace alongside, you know, her brother, her ancestor, her mother, who is also technically an ancestor sort of thing. All this sort of shit, right? Like, everybody coming in, helping her out as well, right? The beautiful parallel between the two, having people help them out while they deal with Sphinx in their own unique ways. Love it. I also really love that I mentioned double Yang sword. Priscilla literally uses it as double, right? She takes two and goes boom, and it's really fucking great. And finally, because I didn't mind it for the sake of, you know, lowering what he could do and everything, but it, you know, I was hoping it wasn't going to last too long. I was really hoping it was going to end with this arc, and it does, because it ends with this chapter. Following the Hall of Memories stuff, Subaru is back to normal. He's not a child anymore. He's back to regular size. It's really great, and he even hugs Amelia. I love it. And now we have the final chapter. So, here's the thing. I knew something like this was going to happen. Or at least I had the general implication of that. Because there was so much artwork. There was people pointing out the previous volume cover. There was people pointing out the new volume cover. There was all this shit that made me assume this was happening. And I wasn't actually opposed to it at all. Because something I feel like the series is missing is a proper permadeath. Right? It's something that I've wanted for a while. Now, I know there's some characters people are going to point out. I will get to them in a minute. But I've always wanted a proper permadeath from the series. Something that actually essentially shows, even if Subaru could return by death, in this sort of scenario, it won't happen, right? And it really hurts, right? Now, the examples I was going to bring up for stuff that I don't think count towards this are villains, for example, because a majority of villains we know are going to die, right? You see, like, Regulus, and it's like, well, they're not going to forgive that guy they're gonna kill him. Like, Meili's the only exception as a antagonist because she's a child. She's a child who had to go through absurd level of trauma or absurd levels rather, to singular, but absurd levels of trauma to essentially create this, like, cold assassin, right? It's not really great, but it's also a very clear thing of like, well, she's also still a child, and she was conditioned this way. So it makes sense to forgive her and try to, put her back on the right path. Whereas everybody else that is an antagonist, for the most part, is kind of just a thing of like, well, yeah, no, they have to kill them. Because what else is that antagonist gonna do? Right? Other than like Spica and Melee, what's gonna happen, right? So that's the thing. Then there are also characters who die in the same arc they're established. Prime example for me is Shaola, right? She's great. I like her a lot. I did lower her because I thought about it more because of this chapter. But she's real great. However, I do think if a character is established in an arc and then killed, it is kind of a thing of like, well, yeah, I got to know them and they were nice, but at the same time, it's not entirely surprising that it ended in this scenario, right? I mean, they always kind of foreshadowed something like this before. So, yeah. But stuff like that to me makes sense. As well as, I'm not going to say Shaola is not an important character because she's literally one of the big ones from the past, right? But, to me, somebody who is a royal selection candidate is a very important character. And that's why this chapter is so surprising. It's a welcome change, but it is a bittersweet one. We get Priscilla, hanging out, like, she's essentially forcing Subaru to join her. And she goes around and speaks to people, right? She speaks to Schultz and Hanko. She speaks to her brother. She speaks to Yorna and Ugard, who Yorna pretty much establishes that she'd like to remove the curse she has, so that, her and her beloved can essentially just die. There isn't any, come back as like a zombie, or there's not, get reincarnated into this body. That's it, right? Yorna will meet her end. Iris will meet her end. Also part of the Vincent thing is Priscilla pointing out that perhaps, her brother has some, like, love for Medium and all that, and I really like it, because, like, they're sleeping on the couch there and everything. Like, Medium and Flop are. I should establish, not Vincent himself. Though Vincent does close both his eyes, which is a good change, right? Then we get her talking to Amelia and Anastasia, and you can actually tell by the way she's talking to them, at least towards the end, right? That the fact that she points out that they're royal selection candidates and everything, and like everybody's confused of like, what's she saying? Like, why is she pointing that out? You can tell that she knows she's going to die, right? And then we keep going with Priscilla. She talks to Rem, where we get Rem being real sweet and everything, and Priscilla essentially telling her to follow the ripples in her heart. I feel like that's pointing in an obvious direction, right? Like, I don't think in terms of Priscilla and her own mind, it might be, but I'm not sure. However, I think plot-wise, it's trying to point in a specific direction. And then he arrives at where Al is. And while there, there's some drinks and everything, some glasses, there's two specifically. And Priscilla gets Al and Subaru to share a glass, because their achievements here, like with this battle, were really well done, right? She's proud of both of them. They both share a glass. Priscilla has her own drink. Priscilla engages in a dance with Al while Subaru sings, very clearly trying to have an insert song for his VA, because I know he does that sort of stuff, right? Or like he can, rather. So we get a great dance between Al and Priscilla. And then after a few loops of the song, it stops, because they notice something. Priscilla's fading away. When she burned that whole alternate space, it was the thing of, well, how does she get out of there without killing herself? The answer is, she did. She killed herself to get out of there. She burned that whole place down, including herself, just to get out. So, now Priscilla's fading away. And, Al's crying and everything. She's essentially comforting him and all that. But still having a light jest about things. Talking about the world still being hers. She has a great monologue that she gives at the end, and also even calls Subaru a true knight, which I really love. And then she goes, and it hurts a lot, right? I was really starting to like Priscilla, and I knew this was probably going to happen, right? But I was really starting to enjoy her a ton. And this chapter hurts like a ton of bricks. After, Teppei kind of gets you to really enjoy her as a character. It kind of sucks to see. And the interesting thing to point out is the end of the chapter. I don't know if this is just translation wording or if this is like exact, but the interesting thing to point out is the last line of it mentions the first to drop out of the royal selection. Now, part of this might be people voting and therefore, certain ones drop out that are the lowest, or that literally could be foreshadowing for what's to come. I would not be surprised about that. Think about Crush's state, right? So, yeah, but this chapter hurts. It's a really good end to the arc. It really improves it with just a single chapter. I mean, it was already really good, but this really swings it above arc 3 for me. Yeah, this is a really good chapter. A great send-off for her, and it's real sad. It's real sad. It's shocking to think that Priscilla, of all characters, was going to die here. But, and I kind of wanted her to be friends with Amelia, similar to Anastasia and Krush and all that. Maybe not Krush, but I mean, Krush felt like, in debt to Subaru and all that, and would still view, even if they were against each other and had to kill each other, it was the thing of, like, she would still view him as like an ally of sorts, right? Like as a friend almost, right? But yeah, it hurts to see this. Hurts to see this a lot. But that's it. That's the arc. With that, we have our conclusion to Arc 8. And this really was a massive improvement compared to Arc 7. I liked Arc 7, but I had problems with it, and that's why I ended up putting it lower than Arc 4. Not to say that's bad, both are on B, right? Should be noted, B is not a bad rank at all. That's pretty good, right? B is a good rank, right? But I put it lower than Arc 4. And it was mainly because I had problems here and there with some volumes. Like, some volumes were really great, and then some were okay, and then some were less than that. But, like, it was all over the place to me. And a lot of it was just establishing the scenario of this whole war, which I didn't mind, right? Because, I mean, Arc 8, like I said, really damn good arc. This is very enjoyable. I can't wait to see this animated in probably like 10 years or something like that, but I'll wait. I'll wait for that. 10 years might be a little overdramatic, but there's a lot to cover, to be fair. But anyways, I do really like this arc a lot. I did have problems with 7, but they were fixed here, right? There is pretty much no volume here that I did not enjoy, right? Pretty much all of them at least got to pretty good or higher. That was every volume here. I enjoyed all of them. So, really, it makes sense to put it above Arc 3, because, yeah, it was consistently just real damn good. Had some great send-offs in there, the obvious ones being Priscilla and Balroy. Overall, just an absurdly good arc. I am still curious to see if short stories will cover some of the stuff we don't know. Like, the obvious thing is, I'm thinking about the first volume, and the fact that, Todd got hit in the face with his own axe, and then he fell, and then we have no clue where he is, or if he's even alive. There is that. But I guess we'll have to see. So, that's about it. I actually don't have much I'm gonna say here, really. I have more videos, of course, on the way and everything. I'm working on some smaller stuff for the 10-year project, which I know sounds bad, because it's like, oh, I thought you were done with that. I am. I'm just wrapping up the small little things that I need to do.
and then I swear I am like fully back here, right? I am still working on stuff, of course, right? Like, it should be noted, it's not like I broke that promise or anything. I am still working on stuff. It's just I also have some small bits to handle, and then when I handle all those small bits, it's like I don't even have to like worry about that then, right? So then it's like, okay, I can entirely focus my gaze upon, you know, all these video projects and streaming and all that, right? Whereas right now it's like, yeah, I can focus on that, but I also do need to handle a little bit of that, right? So it's like every now and then like swapping between them. I'm sure I will be done within like the month, something like that. Should be, at the very least. But yeah, that's about it for this video. So take care, have yourselves a great night, great day, whatever it may be, whatever time you're watching this. And I'll see you all with, I mean, I guess Arc 9. I mean, technically speaking, whatever video comes next, you know, if you're interested, which really appreciate that sort of stuff. But otherwise, you know, if you're just here for the ReZero stuff, all good. I'll see you all with Arc 9. Or videos I might make in between that. Or also, if you figure out the 10-year project, I'll probably make the short story video possibly sooner. I don't know. Depends on when Arc 9 starts. But yeah, see you!